For centuries, we've been asking the wrong question. How do we go faster? That question assumes speed is the enemy. It isn't. The universe never said you couldn't arrive somewhere faster than light. It only said you cannot move through space locally faster than light. Those are not the same thing. Imagine an ant crawling across a rubber sheet. Its speed is limited. But stretch the sheet, fold it, compress it, and the ant arrives without ever breaking its speed limit. The ant didn't cheat. The geometry changed. Physics is not offended by shortcuts. It's offended by contradictions. Now, here's the unsettling part. When scientists stopped obsessing over engines and started questioning distance itself, something strange happened. The equations didn't scream impossible. They whispered, be careful. Because space-time is not a rigid stage. It's a participant. Under extreme conditions, space can expand, contract, and rearrange itself. Not metaphorically, mathematically. And if space itself moves, then objects inside it are not violating any speed limit at all. This is where people panic and shout science fiction. But physics doesn't care what feels comfortable. It cares about consistency. The real obstacle isn't speed, it's causality. If information arrives before it's sent, logic collapses, effects precede causes, reality eats itself. Nature absolutely refuses that, so the challenge becomes brutally precise. Can space-time be engineered in a way that preserves causality while collapsing distance? That's not fantasy, that's a question, and questions are dangerous, because once you write them down honestly, without ego, the math either kills the idea or sharpens it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most faster-than-light concepts fail not because they're bold, but because they're sloppy. They ignore energy cost, they ignore quantum instability, they ignore the fact that the universe always sends you a bill. But a few ideas survive longer than expected, not because they promise miracles, but because they respect the rules while bending the board. And that's the lesson. Scientific progress doesn't come from shouting impossible or screaming breakthrough. It comes from asking questions so precise that nature is forced to answer honestly. 10 times faster than light? That phrase is meaningless. Unless you understand what is moving, what is fixed, and what you're willing to pay, the future won't belong to faster engines. It will belong to better questions, and the universe, reluctantly, always responds. Speed versus distance is the wrong question, and it always has been. The moment we ask how fast something can move, we trap ourselves inside a human intuition that the universe never promised to respect. We imagine motion as a race across a fixed stage with speed limits painted onto the floor like traffic signs. But nature does not operate on intuition. It operates on structure. And the structure of reality makes speed far less interesting than geometry. The speed of light is not a wall in space. It is a rule about local behavior. It tells us how fast cause can chase effect when nothing else is changing. That's all. It does not say space itself must sit still. It does not say distance is sacred. It simply says that if you are here and something happens there, information connecting the two must obey a limit if space between them remains unchanged. And that assumption, that distance is fixed, is where thinking collapses. Space is not an empty container. It stretches, it contracts, it bends under energy and pressure. We know this not from speculation, but from measurement. Galaxies are not flying away from each other like debris from an explosion. Space itself is expanding between them. No galaxy is locally breaking the light barrier, yet distances grow faster than light can cross them. That is not an exception. That is a clue. If space can expand, it can also be manipulated in print. IPO. The equations do not forbid it. They warn us about cost, instability, and consequences, but they do not prohibit rearrangement, which means the obsession with speed misses the deeper lever available to reality, changing the distance instead of outrunning it. This distinction matters because physics is conservative. It hates violations. It tolerates cleverness. When you try to move faster than light through space, you violate causality. Effects outrun causes. Paradoxes appear. The universe slams the door. But when you ask whether space itself can be reshaped so that 2 points become neighbors, the universe does not scream. It hesitates. And hesitation in physics is an invitation to investigate. Consider what distance actually is. It is not a physical object. You cannot touch a meter. You infer it from signals traveling back and forth. Distance is bookkeeping. And like all bookkeeping systems, it depends on assumptions. Change the assumptions, and the numbers change without anything locally misbehaving. This is why the most radical ideas never start with engines. They start with geometry. They ask whether the path itself can be altered so that the journey becomes trivial. If you fold a map, two distant cities become adjacent without either one moving. The ink does not travel faster. The paper changes shape. People object emotionally to this because it feels like cheating, but physics does not care about fairness. It cares about consistency. And there is nothing inconsistent about a universe where the stage participates in the play. Now, This is where intellectual honesty becomes non-negotiable. Reshaping space is not free. Energy requirements appear, exotic conditions arise. Instabilities threaten to tear the structure apart. Nature always demands payment. Anyone who ignores the bill is selling fantasy, not science. But demanding payment is not the same as forbidding the transaction. The mistake most people make is assuming that because something is difficult, it is impossible. That is not how nature operates. Nature draws hard lines only where logic breaks. Faster than light motion through space breaks logic. Changing the space itself challenges engineering, not causality. And that difference is everything. Once you understand this, the phrase 10 times faster than light becomes meaningless. Faster than light relative to what? Through which geometry, measured by which clocks? The universe does not care about slogans. It cares about definitions. The real question is not how fast we can go, but how cleverly we can define the path. Every major advance in physics came from abandoning the obvious question and replacing it with a sharper one. Not how heavy is it, but how does it fall? Not what force pushes planets, but what shape does mass carve into space? Progress happens when we stop asking questions that feel natural and start asking questions that feel uncomfortable. Speed versus distance feels natural. Geometry versus causality feels uncomfortable. That's why it matters. If the future ever produces a way to cross cosmic distances and human timescales, it will not look like a rocket screaming through space at impossible speed. It will look quiet, subtle, almost boring. Nothing locally breaks the rules. Nothing outruns light in its neighborhood. And yet somehow two places that were once impossibly far apart simply stop being so. That outcome would not represent a rebellion against physics. It would represent obedience, taken to its logical extreme. And the only people who will recognize it when it happens are those who learned early that speed was never the point. Nature allows shortcuts, not cheating, and the difference between those two ideas is where most bad science is born. Cheating is trying to win while pretending the rules don't exist. Shortcuts are what happen when you understand the rules so well that you stop fighting them and start using them. The universe has never rewarded defiance. Rewards comprehension. Every physical law we know behaves this way. You can't build a machine that creates energy from nothing, but you can build one that wastes almost none. You can't signal information faster than light in a local frame, but you can arrange circumstances where distance itself becomes irrelevant. Nature isn't moral. It doesn't punish ambition. It punishes contradictions. If your idea collapses logic, it dies instantly. If it preserves consistency, it's allowed to struggle. This is why the word impossible is usually a confession of intellectual laziness. Most things declared impossible were simply attempted in the dumbest way first. Flying was impossible until lift was understood. Spaceflight was impossible until weight was treated as a force to escape rather than a condition to endure. In every case, progress came not from overpowering nature, but from aligning with it. Nature does not respond to brute force. It responds to structure. When people imagine faster than light travel, they imagine cheating. A ship blasting through space, ignoring limits, smashing through barriers like a cartoon. That picture fails instantly because it violates causality. Effects arrive before causes. The universe doesn't negotiate on that point. Reality becomes inconsistent, and inconsistency is the one thing physics absolutely refuses to tolerate. But when the same idea is reframed as a shortcut, something changes. A shortcut does not break the rules, it exploits their deeper implications. It asks whether the constraint applies to what we think it applies to. It asks whether we misunderstood the playing field. Consider how rivers behave. Water does not move uphill. That rule is strict. Yet canals exist. Locks exist. Entire shipping systems operate without violating gravity. The water never cheats. The terrain is arranged so that downhill exists where you need it. The rule remains intact. The outcome changes. Physics works the same way. If you try to overpower a law, it crushes you. If you understand the law, you find degrees of freedom you didn't know were there. This is why thought experiments matter. Not because they predict gadgets, but because they expose where the rules are actually enforced. When you imagine an extreme scenario and follow it carefully, the universe tells you exactly where it will tolerate creativity and where it will not. It doesn't shout. It constrains. Shortcuts always come with costs. Anyone who claims otherwise is lying or ignorant. Nature allows efficiency, not charity. If you want to compress distance, energy appears in the equations. If you want to stabilize an exotic configuration, quantum effects push back. Every shortcut comes with trade-offs that must be paid continuously, not once. But payment is not prohibition. The failure of most speculative ideas is not that they are bold. It's that they ignore the bill. They focus on the destination and forget the maintenance. Nature is fine with clever constructions, but it will not babysit them. If a structure is unstable, it collapses. If an idea requires infinite energy, it is quietly rejected. That's not cruelty. That's accounting. The universe is an accountant with perfect books. You can move numbers around, but the totals must match. If they don't, the proposal is denied. This is the deeper reason shortcuts are allowed. They preserve the balance sheet. Cheating doesn't. A shortcut rearranges terms without changing the sum. Cheating tries to erase terms and hopes no one notices. When people say nature wouldn't allow that, what they usually mean is, I don't see how the cost could be paid. That's an honest concern, but it is not a proof. The correct response is not dismissal, but calculation. Write it down, follow it through, see where it fails. If it collapses, good. You learn something real. Intellectual discipline is the difference between fantasy and progress. You don't get points for imagination alone. You get points for I. Imagination that survives contact with equations. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Nature has already shown us shortcuts we once thought absurd. Time dilation, length contraction, curved space-time, quantum tunneling. None of these feel fair. All of them are real. Each one preserves the rules while violating expectation. Nature does not owe us intuitive answers. It owes us consistent ones. So when an idea appears that seems to slip past a limit without breaking it, the correct reaction is not excitement or rejection. It is suspicion followed by work. The universe is subtle, but it is not sloppy. If a shortcut exists, it will be narrow, expensive, and fragile. It will demand precision. It will punish arrogance, but it will exist if and only if it does not contradict itself. That is the line that separates science from storytelling. Not whether something sounds extreme, but whether it cheats. And nature, without exception, always allows shortcuts, right up until the moment you try to lie to it. The universe cares about consistency, not intuition, and that fact is responsible for nearly every moment in history when human confidence collided with reality and lost. Intuition is a survival tool, not a truth detector. It evolved to keep us alive at walking speeds, moderate temperatures, and familiar scales. The universe operates far outside those conditions, and it does not slow down or simplify itself to accommodate how things feel to us. When intuition fails, people don't usually abandon it. They defend it. They insist reality must be wrong because it doesn't behave the way their minds expect. That instinct has delayed progress more than ignorance ever has. Ignorance can be fixed. Attachment to intuition resists correction. Consistency, on the other hand, is non-negotiable. A universe that contradicts itself cannot exist long enough to be observed. Every law we discover is not a preference, but a requirement for logical survival. If causes did not precede effects, memory would be meaningless. If conservation laws failed randomly, prediction would collapse. The universe does not care whether its rules feel elegant or ugly. They must fit together without tearing. This is why nature often behaves in ways that appear absurd. Objects contract when they move faster. Time slows down depending on speed and gravity. Particles exist in superpositions until measured. None of this feels reasonable. All of it is internally consistent. The equations close, the predictions work. That is the only standard reality enforces. Human intuition, by contrast, is local and biased. It assumes space is flat because we evolved on a nearly flat patch. It assumes time flows uniformly because our nervous systems rely on regular rhythms. It assumes simultaneity is absolute because our experiences occur at low speeds and short distances. These assumptions feel obvious. They are also wrong. The danger arises when intuition is mistaken for evidence. When something doesn't make sense, what that usually means is that it doesn't match a mental model built for survival, not for cosmic accuracy. The universe does not negotiate with mental comfort. It continues behaving as it always has, indifferent to whether anyone understands it. This becomes critical when dealing with extreme ideas. The moment a proposal sounds strange, intuition demands rejection. But strangeness is not a flaw. Inconsistency is. An idea can feel outrageous and still be correct. It can feel reasonable and still be false. Only logical coherence decides. Consider how often intuition has failed spectacularly. People once believed heavier objects fall faster. They once believed time was absolute. They once believed space was an empty stage. These beliefs weren't stupid. They were intuitive. And they were wrong. They were replaced not because they offended common sense, but because they failed consistency tests when measured carefully. Nature does not punish imagination. It punishes contrariety. Science. If an idea allows paradoxes, infinite values, or logical loops, it dies immediately. If it preserves structure, even when it shocks common sense, it survives long enough to be explored. This is why mathematics is such a powerful filter. Mathematics does not care how you feel about a result. It only cares whether the statements agree with each other. When the math works, intuition must adapt. When the math breaks, imagination is discarded. This process is ruthless and fair. People often accuse advanced physics of being disconnected from reality because it contradicts everyday experience. This is backwards. Everyday experience is disconnected from reality at extreme scales. Physics does not become strange because scientists enjoy confusion. It becomes strange because reality is strange when examined honestly. Consistency is the invisible referee. It decides which ideas are allowed to exist and which are quietly erased. The universe will tolerate almost anything except logical failure. It will tolerate warped space, stretched time, particles appearing from fluctuations. What it will not tolerate is a story that cannot close its own loops. This is why faster-than-light claims collapse so often. Not because they feel impossible, but because they allow effects to outrun causes. Memory breaks. Information arrives before it is sent. The structure of reality tears. Intuition might accept it. Consistency will not. Understanding this changes how questions are asked. Instead of demanding that an idea make sense, the better demand is that it make itself whole. Does it preserve causality? Does it respect conservation? Does it remain stable under small disturbances? If the answers are yes, intuition becomes irrelevant. The history of progress is the history of intuition being dragged unwillingly behind consistency. Every time we discovered something real, it felt wrong first. Only later did it become obvious. That delay is not a flaw in science. It is a feature of being human. The universe is not obligated to be understandable at first glance. It is obligated only to be itself, and it is relentlessly consistent. Those who advance knowledge are not the ones with the strongest intuition. They are the ones willing to distrust it, test it, and abandon it the moment it conflicts with internal coherence. Reality does not reward those who feel correct. It rewards those who are consistent. Once that lesson is learned, confusion stops being a threat. It becomes a signal. When intuition protests loudly, it is often pointing directly at the edge of understanding. And beyond that edge, consistency waits. Indifferent, precise, and uncompromising. Information, causality, and energy are the real gatekeepers, and every grand idea that ignores even one of them collapses under its own ambition. These three are not suggestions or guidelines. They are the structural supports of reality. You can push against them, you can test their limits, but the moment you pretend they don't exist, the universe ends the conversation. Information comes first because it defines what can be known, compared, and remembered. Without information, events are meaningless. A universe where information can appear freely, vanish arbitrarily, or travel without constraint would be a universe where prediction is impossible and memory has no anchor. Every physical process, no matter how mechanical it looks, is also an information process. Signals propagate, states evolve, correlations form. If information behaves inconsistently, reality loses its ability to describe itself. This is why limits on information transfer are sacred. They are not arbitrary speed limits, they are safeguards against logical breakdown. If information could arrive before it was sent, cause and effect would reverse. Messages could erase their own origins. Histories would contradict themselves. The universe refuses this scenario not because it is uncomfortable, but because it is incoherent, consist. Tendency demands that information follow a strict order. Causality is the rule that enforces that order. Causes precede effects, not as a philosophical preference, but as a requirement for structure. Without causality, the concept of explanation collapses. You cannot explain an event if it can be influenced by outcomes that have not yet occurred. Science itself would be impossible in such a universe because experiments would not have stable relationships between setup and result. People often misunderstand causality as a simple arrow of time. It is much more than that. It is the framework that prevents paradoxes. It is the reason you cannot send warnings to your past self. Not because it sounds absurd, but because it would destroy the logical integrity of reality. A universe that allows self-contradicting histories cannot maintain stable laws. Energy is the enforcer. Information and causality define what is allowed. Energy decides what is affordable. Every change in physical state requires energy. Every structure must be supported against collapse. There are no free rearrangements of reality. If you want to bend space, stabilize a configuration, or maintain an exotic condition, energy appears in the equations like a bill that must be paid continuously. This is where many speculative ideas fail. They focus on possibility and ignore cost. They show that something might be allowed in principle, then quietly assume the universe will subsidize it. It will not. Nature demands accounting. If an idea requires infinite energy, it is not forbidden, it is irrelevant. Anything that cannot be paid for cannot be built. These three gatekeepers work together. You cannot satisfy one while violating the others. An idea that preserves energy but breaks causality is rejected. An idea that respects causality but allows uncontrolled information flow collapses. An idea that keeps information consistent but demands impossible energy never leaves the page. What makes these constraints powerful is that they are not negotiable, they are not cultural, they do not depend on technology, they are woven into the structure of physical law. Technology does not weaken them, it reveals them more clearly. This is why the universe often appears conservative. It is not resisting progress, it is preserving coherence. When something new emerges, it does so by threading a narrow path through these constraints, not by bulldozing them. The more extreme the outcome, the tighter the path. Understanding this reframes ambition. The goal is no longer to ask what we want to happen, but what can happen without tearing the fabric of logic. The most powerful ideas are not those that shout the loudest, but those that whisper, "I fit." Consider how often revolutionary discoveries initially looked trivial. They didn't promise miracles. They promised consistency under conditions no one had tested before. Only later did their implications explode. Nature rewards patience and precision, not spectacle. Information, causality, and energy do not kill imagination. They shape it. They force creativity into forms that can survive contact with reality. Anyone can imagine a universe where anything is possible. That requires no intelligence. The challenge is imagining a universe where everything possible must also make sense. This is why serious thinking feels restrictive at first. Constraints feel like obstacles until you realize they are guidance. They tell you where not to waste effort. They tell you which directions collapse into nonsense and which might, with enough work, remain standing. Every idea that endures does so because it satisfies these gatekeepers simultaneously. It keeps information orderly. It preserves cause and effect. It pays its energy costs honestly. That combination is rare, and it is why progress is slow. But when an idea passes all three, the universe does not resist it. It allows it quietly, indifferently, without applause. Reality does not celebrate breakthroughs. It simply remains consistent, and consistency is the highest permission it ever grants. The dangerous power of thought experiments is not that they imagine impossible things, but that they expose whether our understanding is real or cosmetic. A thought experiment is a test with nowhere to hide. There are no instruments to blame, no noise to excuse, no experimental error to rescue a bad idea. If your reasoning fails in your head, it will fail everywhere else too. This is why thought experiments terrify weak theories. They strip ideas down to their logical skeleton. You remove the engineering, the technology, the excuses, and ask a single unforgiving question. If the laws you claim to believe are true, what must follow? Not what you hope follows, not what feels reasonable. What must follow? Most people misunderstand thought experiments as imagination games. They are not. They are precision tools. They are scalpels, not paintbrushes. When used correctly, they cut directly into the assumptions you didn't know you were making. The danger comes from their honesty. In a real experiment, complexity can hide ignorance. In a thought experiment, complexity is a liability. Every unnecessary detail is stripped away until only structure remains. And structure is where contradictions live. If your idea allows a paradox, the thought experiment will find it immediately. If it violates causality, it will expose the violation without mercy. This is why so many dramatic ideas die on the page before they ever reach a laboratory. They sound impressive until you push them to their logical extreme. Then they collapse. Not because nature is cruel, but because logic is a thought experiment does not ask whether something can be built. It asks whether it can exist without tearing itself apart. That distinction matters. Engineering difficulties are temporary. Logical impossibilities are permanent. Technology advances, contradictions do not. This is also why thought experiments feel dangerous to intuition. They often lead to conclusions that feel absurd, even offensive. But feelings are irrelevant here. A good thought experiment doesn't care how strange the answer seems. It only cares whether the reasoning is airtight. When someone dismisses a conclusion by saying, "That doesn't make sense," what they usually mean is, "That doesn't match my mental habits." A thought experiment doesn't negotiate with habits. It forces you to follow the consequences of your own beliefs step by step until you either accept the result or abandon the belief. That process is uncomfortable. It should be. Comfort is a sign that nothing fundamental is being questioned. The most powerful thought experiments are simple, not because reality is simple, but because simplicity removes camouflage. When only a few assumptions are present, each one becomes visible. You can no longer pretend a hidden premise isn't doing the real work. This is where the danger sharpens. Once an assumption is exposed, you must answer for it. Why is it there? Is it necessary? Is it justified? Or is it just familiar? Entire frameworks have collapsed because of this process. Not because new data arrived, but because someone followed an old idea to its logical conclusion and realized it couldn't survive its own implications. No explosion, no drama, just inconsistency revealed. Thought experiments are especially lethal when applied to extreme cases. Push a theory to the edge of its domain and see whether it breaks cleanly or shatters. Does it remain coherent when quantities become very large, very small, very fast, or very dense? Or does it produce infinities, paradoxes, and undefined behavior? Nature does not tolerate undefined behavior. That is a human programming error, not a feature of reality. The danger is amplified because thought experiments are cheap. They cost nothing but discipline. Anyone can run them, and that makes them threatening to authority. You do not need permission, few, or equipment to discover a contradiction. You only need the courage to ask the wrong question and the honesty to accept the answer. This is why progress often comes from people who are not impressed by complexity. They are impressed by coherence. They do not ask whether an idea sounds sophisticated. They ask whether it survives its own logic. There is also a second danger, subtler and more personal. Thought experiments do not only test theories, they test thinkers. They reveal who is willing to follow reasoning to an uncomfortable place and who retreats the moment it threatens identity or reputation. The experiment doesn't care who you are. It treats every mind equally. That is why thought experiments feel ruthless. They offer no partial credit. Either the idea holds together or it doesn't. You cannot argue with the conclusion without arguing with your own premises. This is also why thought experiments are so often misunderstood after the fact. When a conclusion turns out to be correct, people rewrite history and pretend it was obvious. It never was. It was disturbing. It violated intuition. That is why it mattered. The true danger of thought experiments is not that they lead us astray. It is that they force us to confront how much of what we know is inherited habit rather than earned understanding. Used carelessly, they produce nonsense. Used rigorously, they expose nonsense. The difference is discipline. A thought experiment must be constrained by the same rules as reality. The moment you allow yourself to cheat, it becomes fiction, but when done properly, a thought experiment is one of the most powerful tools ever created. It allows the mind to explore territory before the world catches up. It does not predict gadgets. It tests consistency, and consistency is the one thing the universe never forgives you for getting wrong. That is why thought experiments are dangerous, not because they are imaginative, but because they are honest. The future belongs to those who ask the right question, not because answers are unimportant, but because answers expire while good questions compound. An answer solves a problem once. A question reshapes the way problems are seen forever. History doesn't move forward on certainty. It moves forward on better curiosity. Most people are trained to hunt answers. From childhood, success is measured by how quickly a correct response can be produced. But reality does not reward speed of response. It rewards depth of inquiry. When the question is shallow, even a perfect answer is useless. When the question is sharp, even an incomplete answer can change the world. The wrong question locks you into a dead end. It narrows possibility without you noticing. Ask how to make a horse run faster, and you will never invent an engine. Ask how to move without a horse, and an entire future opens. The limitation was not technology. It was the question. This is why revolutions rarely come from people with more data. They come from people who reframe the problem. They notice that everyone else is solving the same puzzle on the same board, and they quietly move the board itself. The universe responds differently to different questions. Ask how to break a law of nature, and the answer is always no. Ask why the law exists, and suddenly you are allowed to explore its boundaries. Nature does not explain itself to demands. It reveals itself to curiosity disciplined by respect. The right question has a specific feel. It is uncomfortable. It removes easy answers instead of inviting them. It exposes assumptions you didn't realize you were making. It often sounds simple, which is why it is so dangerous. Complexity hides ignorance. Simplicity reveals it. This is why experts are sometimes the last to see what matters. Expertise is built on mastering existing questions. When those questions become outdated, mastery becomes inertia. Progress requires the humility to ask something that sounds naive but cuts deep. Than sophistication ever did. The future is not built by people who shout conclusions. It is built by people who are willing to look ignorant in the short term. Asking the right question often feels like stepping backward. You abandon the safety of familiar problems and risk discovering that your previous work was aimed at the wrong target. That risk is real. Many resist it. They protect their answers because their identity is attached to them. But reality is indifferent to identity. It only responds to coherence. A powerful question does something subtle. It forces reality to answer honestly. Not immediately, not conveniently, but inevitably. Once the right question exists, the universe cannot avoid it. Experiments are designed differently. Models are rewritten. Entire fields shift direction, not because the answer was known, but because the question demanded it. The wrong question, by contrast, can keep brilliant people busy for generations with nothing to show for it. Effort is not the issue. Direction is. You can work endlessly and still go nowhere if the problem itself is misframed. This is why the future is never evenly distributed. It belongs disproportionately to those who see the problem differently early. They are not necessarily smarter. They are often just more willing to doubt the obvious. Asking the right question requires a rare combination of traits. Curiosity without discipline produces noise. Discipline without curiosity produces stagnation. The balance is fragile. Lose either, and progress stops. The right question also has timing. Ask it too early and no one understands why it matters. Ask it too late and someone else has already claimed the future. This is why recognition often lags behind impact. The question mattered long before the world noticed. What makes this unsettling is that there is no formula for the right question. It cannot be memorized or automated. It emerges from deep engagement and dissatisfaction. It appears when someone looks at accepted explanations and quietly thinks, "This doesn't feel complete." That moment is the birthplace of the future. The future does not reward those who are most confident. It rewards those who are most precise about their ignorance. Knowing exactly what you do not understand is more powerful than knowing 1,000 things that do not matter. Once the right question is asked, progress becomes almost inevitable. Not easy, not fast, but directed. Energy stops being wasted. Effort accumulates. Even failures contribute because they refine the question instead of obscuring it. Answers age. Technologies become obsolete. But a well-formed question can guide discovery across decades. It can survive changing tools, new data, and shifting paradigms because it is rooted in structure, not fashion. The future belongs to those who ask the right question because asking it is an act of alignment with reality. It signals that you are no longer trying to force the universe to give you what you want. You are trying to understand what it will allow. And once you do that, the universe becomes an unwilling collaborator. Not generous, not kind, but honest. And honesty in the long run always wins. People love complicated answers. Nature doesn't. Let me show you something embarrassingly simple. 2 slits and a screen. That's it. No philosophy, no poetry, just hardware. You fire particles one at a time, not waves, not clouds, one at a time. And somehow, impossibly, an interference pattern appears. That means each particle behaves as if it went through both slits. Now here's where reality starts sweating. You decide to check which slit the particle uses. Just check. You don't touch it, you don't push it, you only ask a question. The moment you ask, the pattern disappears, not because you disturb the particle, but because nature refuses to answer 2 questions at once. This is not about technology. This is about information. Here's the uncomfortable part. If you erase the information after the particle has already passed the slits, the outcome still changes. Read that again. Your present choice rewrites what the particle appears to have done in the past. So don't talk to me about time like it's a straight line. Time behaves more like a negotiation. Nature doesn't commit to a history until it's forced to. And that should bother you because it means reality isn't sitting there fully formed waiting for us. It's waiting for a question. If you think this proves the universe is magical, you're lazy. If you think it's nonsense, you're arrogant. The correct response is discomfort. Because the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. It only agrees to behave consistently when you stop lying to yourself about how simple it should be. And if you think you understand this experiment, you don't. That's not a failure. That's the beginning of intelligence. The simplest experiment that breaks reality doesn't require billion-dollar machines or exotic materials. It uses a wall, 2 narrow slits, a screen, and a single uncomfortable question. That's all it takes to humiliate common sense. You don't need advanced mathematics to feel the damage. You just need honesty. Imagine firing tiny particles, one by one, toward a barrier with 2 slits cut into it. Logic says each particle must choose one slit or the other. There are only 2 options, no mystery yet. But when you let the particles hit the screen behind the slits, a strange pattern appears. Not 2 simple clusters, but a series of bright and dark bands, a wave pattern. The kind you get when water overlaps with itself. That's impossible. A single particle cannot split itself into overlapping paths, and yet the pattern insists otherwise, even when the particles are sent one at a time, slowly, patiently, as if nature is daring you to accuse it of cheating. Each particle arrives alone, but together they build a pattern that only makes sense if each one behaved like a wave, exploring every possible path simultaneously. At this point, a reasonable person says, fine, let's catch it in the act. So you place a detector at the slits. Nothing violent. You're not smashing the particle. You're just asking a simple question: which slit did you go through? The moment you ask, reality flinches. The interference pattern disappears. The particles behave like ordinary objects again, choosing one slit, leaving behind two boring piles on the screen. No waves, no mystery, just obedience. This is where most explanations collapse, because it's tempting to say the detector disturbed the particle. That would be comforting. That would keep reality polite. But that explanation is wrong. The pattern disappears not because the particle was physically disturbed, but because information now exists. Nature doesn't care about your machines. It cares about what can be known. Here's the disturbing implication. The particle doesn't decide what it is until the question is settled, not until the information is locked in. And now the real trouble begins. You can design the experiment so that the decision to observe or not observe happens after the part. Eichel has already passed the slits. After, not before. Common sense screams that it's too late. The particle already chose its path. History should be fixed, but history refuses to cooperate. If the information is erased, the wave pattern returns, as if the particle never chose a path at all. If the information is preserved, the pattern vanishes, as if it always did. The present choice determines the past description. This is not philosophy. This is measured behavior. Reality behaves as if it keeps its options open, as if it delays committing to a story until it knows what questions will be asked. That should make you deeply uncomfortable, because it means the universe is not passively unfolding in time the way we imagine. We like to think time flows forward cleanly, cause first effect later. But this experiment laughs at that idea. It suggests that time is not a rigid chain, but a flexible bookkeeping system, adjusted to preserve consistency, not intuition. Notice what's missing here. There is no human consciousness required, no observer with a mind, no mystical intention, just the availability of information. Reality responds to what can, in principle, be known, not to who knows it. This destroys a very old assumption that particles are tiny things with definite properties, carrying their behavior with them through space and time. Instead, behavior emerges at the moment of interaction, when questions become unavoidable. The experiment doesn't say particles are confused. It says we are, because the universe is under no obligation to match the stories our brains prefer. Our brains evolved to throw spears and predict weather, not to understand a reality where outcomes depend on unanswered questions. And here's the intellectual trap. If you feel satisfied with any simple explanation, you've missed the point. Anyone who claims to intuitively understand this experiment is either lying or hasn't looked closely enough. The correct reaction is intellectual humility, not confusion as weakness, but confusion as accuracy. This experiment stands as a warning. If such a simple setup can shatter our assumptions about objects, causality, and time, then the problem is not with the universe. The problem is with how confidently we think we understand it. Reality is not weird. Our expectations are, and the double slit doesn't care whether you like that fact. Nature doesn't decide until you look. And that statement sounds poetic until you realize it's a technical description, not a metaphor. It isn't saying reality waits for human attention. It's saying something far more disturbing. Outcomes are not fixed until information becomes unavoidable. We grow up believing the world is already there, fully formed, moving along a clean timeline, whether we pay attention or not. A rock falls, a bullet travels, a planet orbits. We assume the universe carries a complete script, and observation merely reveals what was already written. That assumption works beautifully for everyday life. It fails completely at the fundamental level. When you isolate a particle and remove every unnecessary interaction, it stops behaving like a tiny object with a defined path. It behaves like a collection of possibilities, not uncertainty due to ignorance, but genuine indeterminacy. The particle is not hiding a decision. There is no secret answer waiting to be uncovered. So when you look, you are not discovering a fact. You are forcing one. This is where people panic and start reaching for mystical language. Resist that impulse. Nothing supernatural is happening. The universe is not conscious. It is not watching you. It is doing something much colder and more precise. It is enforcing consistency between questions and answers. An outcome cannot exist without a context. A position cannot exist without a frame of reference. A path cannot exist without a way to distinguish paths. Without those, the question, What happened is meaningless, and nature ref. Uses to answer meaningless questions. This is why measurement is not passive. Measurement is an interaction that limits possibilities. It doesn't disturb reality, it defines it. The act of looking doesn't add noise, it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is not a flaw in the system. It is the default state. The mistake is thinking of observation as peeking into a box. That image assumes the contents were already settled. A better image is locking a door. Once the door is locked, the building must decide which rooms are accessible. Before that, multiple routes remain valid. What's truly unsettling is that this decision doesn't have to be made immediately. Nature is remarkably patient. It allows multiple incompatible histories to coexist as long as no contradiction is exposed. Only when information is registered, when distinctions become irreversible, does the universe commit. This patience breaks our intuition about time. We imagine the past as fixed and the future as open. But at the quantum level, the past is only as fixed as the records that survive. Remove the records, and the past loosens its grip. This does not mean the past changes. It means the description of the past was never finalized. There is a crucial difference. The universe is not rewriting history. It is refusing to finalize it prematurely. This should demolish the comforting idea that particles carry properties like luggage as they move through space. Properties are not possessions. They are relationships. They only exist when something else demands them. Ask for position, and position appears. Ask for momentum, and momentum appears. Ask for a path, and a path appears. But ask for all of them at once, and nature simply says no, not because it's hiding something, but because the question itself is incoherent. This reveals something deeper about knowledge itself. Knowing is not a passive state. Knowledge is an active constraint imposed on reality. Every fact excludes alternatives. Every answer kills possibilities. That's the price of certainty. And nature is extremely economical with certainty. So when you look, you are not illuminating a dark room. You are burning away options. You are forcing the universe to take a stand where it previously refused to. That's why experiments don't just test theories. They shape what can be said about the world. Reality doesn't unfold independently of inquiry. It unfolds in response to it. This doesn't make science subjective. Quite the opposite. It makes it brutally objective. The rules governing which questions can be asked and which answers are allowed are rigid and unforgiving. Your preferences don't matter. Your intuition doesn't matter. Only consistency does. Nature doesn't decide until you look. Not because it's uncertain, but because uncertainty is more efficient than commitment. And until commitment is forced, possibility is not a bug. It's the feature that keeps the universe logically intact. If that bothers you, good. It should, because once you accept this, you can never again pretend that reality is simply out there, waiting patiently to be observed. Reality is something that crystallizes under pressure, and observation is the pressure point. And the moment you look, the universe answers, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. Time is not a straight line, and the sooner you stop pretending it is, the sooner reality starts making sense. The idea that the past is fixed, the present is a razor-thin moment, and the future is wide open feels obvious only because our brains were trained to survive, not to understand the structure of the universe. We experience time as a sequence, so we mistake experience for truth. Physics has no obligation to respect that mistake. In everyday life, cause comes before effect. You push a glass, it falls. You strike a match, it burns. This ordering is so reliable that we confuse it with a fundamental rule of existence. But that order is an AP. Approximation, not a law. It works at human scales, where information flows slowly and interactions are messy. Strip the system down to its most basic level, remove friction, noise, and excess interaction, and time stops behaving politely. At the fundamental scale, events are not arranged like beads on a string. They are arranged more like constraints in a logical system. What must be true, what cannot be true, and what is allowed to remain undecided for as long as possible. Time, in this sense, is not a river flowing forward. It is a bookkeeping process that ensures consistency. This is why certain experiments make it look as though the present is influencing the past. That description is misleading, but the discomfort it produces is earned. When an outcome depends on information that becomes available later, our instinct is to accuse time of running backward. In reality, what's happening is simpler and more disturbing. The story was never finalized in the first place. We assume the past is a completed archive, locked and immutable. But at the microscopic level, the past exists only as long as records exist. If no record survives that distinguishes between two histories, then insisting that one really happened is an emotional preference, not a physical necessity. Time doesn't demand that every event be immediately committed to history. It allows multiple compatible descriptions to coexist until a contradiction would arise. Only then does it enforce a single narrative. This idea clashes violently with common sense because common sense treats time as an external stage on which events march in order. Physics treats time as part of the system, something that interacts with information, measurement, and memory. Once you accept that, linear time stops being sacred. Consider this. If two different sequences of events lead to the same observable outcome and no surviving evidence can distinguish between them, then insisting on one true sequence adds nothing to prediction. Nature has no incentive to pick one just to satisfy our storytelling instincts. This is not philosophy sneaking into physics. This is efficiency. The universe doesn't waste resources specifying details that cannot, even in principle, be observed. Definiteness is expensive. Ambiguity is cheap. So ambiguity is tolerated until it becomes logically impossible. From this perspective, the arrow of time, the feeling that time flows forward, is not fundamental. It emerges from asymmetries. Entropy increases, records accumulate, memories form. Once records exist, the past solidifies. Before that, it's flexible. This explains why we never experience the future influencing the past in daily life. Our world is flooded with records. Every interaction leaves traces. Air molecules, light, heat, memory. Everything is recording everything else. The past becomes overdetermined. There is no room left for ambiguity, but remove those records, isolate the system, and the rigidity dissolves. Then time stops behaving like a line and starts behaving like a set of conditions. What matters is not what happened first, but what must be true for the whole story to make sense. This reframing is uncomfortable because it strips time of its emotional authority. We want the past to be sacred. We want it locked. We want causality to be simple. But the universe does not care what feels comfortable. It only cares that its descriptions don't contradict themselves. So when experiments suggest that future choices affect past outcomes, the correct response is not to panic about paradoxes. The correct response is to recognize that you're imposing a linear story on a system that never promised to follow one. Time is not broken. Our intuition is, at the deepest level, the universe is not playing a movie frame by frame. It is solving a consistency problem. And time, as we experience it, is the shadow of that solution, not the engine driving it. Once you see time this way, many mister lose their drama. The question is no longer how can the future affect the past, but why did we ever assume the past was finalized before it had to be? Time is not a straight line. It's a rule book that only cares about coherence. And the moment you accept that, reality stops looking strange and starts looking brutally efficient. Particles behave like they know the future. And that sentence sounds reckless until you realize it is the least misleading way to describe what the equations and experiments are actually saying. No particle is predicting anything. No intelligence is hiding inside matter. Yet the behavior is impossible to explain if you insist that the particle only responds to its immediate past. Something else is going on, and it doesn't care whether it makes us comfortable. We are trained to think locally. A thing moves because it was pushed. A change happens because something hit it a moment earlier. This way of thinking works beautifully at human scales where interactions are slow, noisy, and isolated. But when you strip a system down to its fundamentals, locality stops being a law and becomes an approximation. In carefully controlled experiments, a particle's outcome depends on conditions that are arranged later in time. Change the experimental setup after the particle has already begun its journey, and the final pattern still adjusts as if the particle had access to information it should not have had, not because it knew the future, but because the description of its behavior was never confined to a single moment in time. The mistake is imagining the particle as a tiny traveler carrying instructions as it moves forward. That picture is intuitive and completely wrong. The particle is not a thing moving through time. It is a process that spans the entire experiment. The beginning, the middle, and the end are all part of one indivisible story. When you analyze the math honestly, you don't calculate what happens step by step in time. You calculate which outcomes are consistent with the entire setup. The system behaves as if it is aware of all the constraints, past and future alike, because the solution depends on the whole configuration, not on a sequence of causes. This is why the language of knowing the future keeps sneaking back in. It's not that the particle anticipates, it's that the universe does not privilege the present moment the way our minds do. We experience time as a flow, so we demand that explanations follow that flow. Physics does not share that demand. It allows descriptions that are global in time, descriptions where the beginning and the end jointly determine what is allowed, in between. This doesn't violate causality in the way people fear. No usable signal travels backward in time. You cannot send a message to yesterday. The rules are tight. What breaks is not causality itself, but the childish version of it where every effect must be traceable to a single earlier push. What replaces it is a more severe rule, consistency. The outcome must fit all constraints simultaneously. If a future measurement choice imposes a constraint, then earlier behavior must align with it, not because the past changed, but because it was never independently defined. This is deeply unsettling because it suggests that events are not born moment by moment. They are selected as a whole. Reality does not assemble itself frame by frame. It resolves itself all at once. At human scales, this distinction is invisible. The number of constraints is enormous. The past is buried under records. The future is constrained by entropy. Everything looks linear. But when you isolate a system enough to remove those constraints, the underlying structure is exposed. Then particles stop acting like objects and start acting like answers to a problem that hasn't been fully stated until the experiment is complete. This reframes what we mean by explanation. Instead of asking what caused this to happen, then the bet. Our question becomes, what global conditions made this outcome unavoidable? That shift feels alien because our intuition is wired for survival, not for consistency proofs. Particles don't know the future, but the universe doesn't wait for time to pass before enforcing its rules. It enforces them across time. Once you accept that, the weirdness loses its mysticism and gains something colder and more impressive: inevitability. The outcome is not guided by foresight, but by the refusal of the universe to allow contradictions, even if avoiding them requires behavior that looks, from our limited perspective, like knowledge of what hasn't happened yet. The future isn't being consulted, the present isn't in charge. And the past isn't sacred. There is only the full structure of the experiment, and the demand that the story taken as a whole makes sense. And if that makes particles seem prophetic, that says more about our assumptions than about their behavior. If you think you understand this, you're wrong. And that's not an insult, it's a diagnostic. The moment something feels intuitive, comfortable, or neatly summarized, you've already replaced the phenomenon with a story that fits inside your head. Reality at this level does not fit. The confidence you feel is not understanding, it's compression. And too much compression destroys the signal. Real understanding begins with resistance. It begins when your explanations stop working, when analogies collapse under their own weight, when every familiar picture turns out to be misleading. That discomfort is not a bug in the learning process. It is the only reliable sign that you are still in contact with the truth. At the deepest levels, the universe does not offer mechanisms you can visualize. It offers rules that produce outcomes, and those rules do not care whether your brain finds them reasonable. Our minds evolved to recognize faces, track moving objects, and predict short-term consequences. They did not evolve to grasp a reality where outcomes depend on unasked questions and histories remain undefined until forced. So when someone says they understand what's going on, what they usually mean is that they've found a metaphor they like. Waves, particles, past, probabilities. These are not explanations, they are linguistic crutches. Useful, temporary, and ultimately inadequate. The danger begins when we forget that the equations work. The predictions are flawless. The technology built on them functions with absurd precision. And yet, the moment you try to turn the math into a story about what is really happening, the floor drops out. Every story contradicts some experiment. Every picture breaks under scrutiny. That is not a failure of science. It is a failure of intuition. We crave a single coherent narrative where things have properties, events have causes, and time flows obediently forward. But the universe does not owe us that narrative. It only owes us consistency. And consistency at this scale does not look like common sense. The most honest thing you can say about this territory is that it resists understanding in the way we usually define it. You can calculate it, you can predict it, you can use it, but understand, as in visualizing a mechanism that feels right, that privilege is revoked. This is why false confidence is so dangerous here. The moment you think you've got it, you stop asking better questions. You start defending your explanation instead of testing it. You mistake familiarity for truth. History is littered with brilliant people who were wrong for exactly that reason. What survives are not the explanations that feel good, but the ones that refuse to collapse under experiment. Nature is ruthless. It does not negotiate. It does not care how elegant your interpretation is if it produces the wrong answer. And here's the humbling part. Even the people who built the framework knew they didn't understand it in the comforting sense. They knew how to calculate. They knew how to predict. And they knew exactly where intuition failed. That honesty is not weakness. It is intellectual discipline. Confusion, when properly aimed, is a form of precision. To say, I don't know what this means, is not to admit defeat. It is to refuse to lie. It is to draw a hard boundary between what the theory guarantees and what your imagination invents to fill the gaps. The universe at this scale is not asking to be visualized. It is asking to be respected. Respect here means not forcing it into human categories just to feel smart. So if you think you understand this, stop. Interrogate that feeling. Ask what assumptions you're smuggling in. Ask which metaphors you've mistaken for mechanisms. Ask what would break if you changed the question slightly. True engagement with this subject does not end in clarity. It ends in sharper questions and fewer illusions. Understanding, in the comforting sense, is a luxury reserved for simple systems. This is not one of them. And the moment you accept that, the moment you stop demanding that reality makes sense on your terms, you are closer to the truth than anyone who claims they've figured it out. You think you know what you're asking when you ask, why do magnets repel? H, you don't. And until you understand why your question is broken, you're going to be frustrated by every answer anyone gives you, including mine. Let me show you the problem. Pick up 2 magnets, north pole to north pole. Feel that push, that invisible resistance in empty air. You want to know why. You want me to say magnets repel for the same reason that H and, then fill in the blank with something. Familiar rubber band springs too, hands pushing against each other, something you already understand. Here's the thing. There is no familiar thing, H, and I'm not being difficult. I'm not hiding behind complexity. I'm telling you the truth that most people don't want to hear. Magnetic forces are fundamental. They're rock bottom. There's nothing underneath them to compare them to. You're asking me to explain electromagnetism by comparing it to something simpler, but there isn't anything simpler. That's like asking me to explain arithmetic by using something more basic than numbers. Can't be done. H. Now you're thinking, wait, I've heard explanations, magnetic fields, electrons, spinning. Those sound like deeper explanations. No, they're descriptions, very precise, very accurate descriptions. They tell you how the force behaves, not why it exists in the first place. And you need to understand the difference between those two things or this entire conversation is pointless. Let me ask you something. Push your hand down on your desk right now. Go ahead, push hard. Why doesn't your hand go through? You'll probably say because the desk is solid. Wrong. Not wrong because the desk isn't solid. It is, but wrong because that's not an explanation. That's just another label for the thing. You're trying to understand. Try again. Why doesn't your hand pass through? Because the atoms are packed together. Better. Keep going. Why don't the atoms in your hand pass through the atoms in the desk? Because atoms are solid too. No. Stop. Think about this. Atoms are not solid. An atom, it's mostly empty. Space, if you scaled an atom up to the size of a football stadium, the nucleus would be a P at the center. The electrons would be tiny dots way out near the seats. Everything in between is empty. Your hand is essentially all empty space. The desk is essentially all empty space. So why don't they pass through each other? You're starting to get uncomfortable now. Good, you should be. The answer is electromagnetic. Repulsion between electrons. The electrons in your hand and the electrons in the desk have the same charge. Like charges repel, so when you push down, you're feeling trillions of tiny electromagnetic interactions all adding up to what you call solid. Now here's the question that's going to really bother you. Why do like charges repel? You can't answer that, can you? You can. Say electromagnetic force, but that's just giving it a name. That's not explaining anything. It's like saying, why do magnets repel? Because of magnetic force. That's circular. That's not an explanation. The electromagnetic force is one of 4 fundamental forces in nature. It's not caused by something else. It's not derived from something simpler. It just is. And here's what nobody tells you. The force that stops your hand at the desk surface, that's the exact same force that makes magnets push apart. The same force, not similar, not analogous, identical, the electromagnetic force. So why does one feel obvious and the other feel mysterious? I'll tell you why. You've been pushing on solid objects since you were 6 months old. By the time you were 2, your brain had built up an enormous library of experiences. Pushing, grabbing, falling down, hitting the ground. Your neurons wired themselves around those experiences. They built patterns, expectations, a whole intuitive framework. So now, when you push on a desk, it feels normal, natural, obvious. You don't think about it. You don't think it needs explaining, but magnets push through empty space. You can see the gap. You can slide a piece of paper through. There's nothing there. That feels weird. That feels wrong. That feels like it needs an explanation. But here's the truth. The weirdness is in your head, not in the physics. When you push on the desk, the electrons in. Your hand never actually touch the electrons in the desk. They repel at a distance, a tiny distance, a few atomic widths, but still a distance. We call it contact because the distance is too small to see. But it's not really contact. Nothing is touching. It's electromagnetic repulsion operating across a gap. With magnets, the gap is bigger, a centimeter, an inch big, enough to see, big enough to make you uncomfortable. But the force is the same. The mechanism is the same. The only difference is scale. The mystery you feel is not a mystery in the physics. It's a mystery in your psychology. You're comfortable with electromagnetic repulsion at atomic distances because you've experienced it your whole life. You're uncomfortable with electromagnetic repulsion at centimeter distances because it's less familiar. That's it. That's the whole difference. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, fine, but surely quantum mechanics explains why the electromagnetic force exists. Wrong. Again, quantum electrodynamics, the quantum theory of electromagnetism, is the most precisely tested theory in all of science. We've measured certain predictions to 11 decimal places, and the theory matches exactly. But here's what QED does. It tells you how to calculate electromagnetic interactions with absurd precision. It gives you rules, equations, predictive power. What it does not do is tell you why the electromagnetic force exists in some deep philosophical sense. It describes the force beautifully, perfectly, but it doesn't explain it away. It doesn't reduce it to something simpler, because there isn't anything simpler. Let me show you how this works with a different example. You ask, why does ice float on water? I can tell you because. Ice is less dense than liquid water. Why is it less dense? Because the molecular structure has more space between the molecules. Why does it have that structure? Because of how hydrogen bonds arrange themselves. At freezing temperatures, why do hydrogen bonds arrange that way? Because of the quantum mechanical properties of electrons in water. Molecules, why do electrons have those properties? Because of the Schrödinger equation and the Pauli exclusion principle. Why do those equations hold? See what's happening at each step? I'm giving you a deeper answer, but I'm also just pushing the question back one level. Eventually, and this happens, fast, you hit bedrock, the fundamental equations, the basic forces, and there, the only honest answer is that's what we measure. That's what the universe does. We can describe it mathematically. We can test it experimentally. We can use it to make predictions and build technology, but we can't explain it in terms of something more fundamental because there isn't anything more fundamental. The chain of why has to end somewhere. Here's the deep problem with your question about magnets. When you ask why, you're not really asking for information. You're asking for comfort. You're asking me to connect the unfamiliar thing to something familiar so you can stop feeling confused. You want a story, a narrative, a chain of cause and effect that ends with something you already understand. But magnets repel because of the electromagnetic force. And the electromagnetic force exists because that's a fundamental property of the universe. There's no story. There's no deeper because there's just measurement. And mathematics now, I know that's not satisfying. I know you want more. But the universe doesn't care what you want. The universe is what it is. Let me tell you what really bothers me about this question. You're treating magnets like they're special, like they're the one weird thing in a universe of normal things. That's backwards. Everything is electromagnetic if you look closely enough. Why do chemicals react? Electromagnetic forces rearranging. Electrons, why does light bounce off mirrors? Electromagnetic interaction. Why do you see colors? Electromagnetic radiation hitting your retina. Why does your computer work? Electromagnetic forces. Moving electrons through circuits. The electromagnetic force isn't some exotic phenomenon that only shows up in magnets. It's everywhere. It's the dominant force in your entire life. Gravity weaker by a factor of 10 to the 36, completely irrelevant for atoms and molecules, the strong and weak nuclear. Forces locked inside atomic nuclei, too, short range to affect anything you can touch. Everything else, and I mean everything, is electromagnetism. The force making magnets push apart is the same force holding your body together right now, the same force preventing you from falling through your chair, the same force letting you read these words. So when you ask me to explain magnetic Repulsion by comparing it to something. Normal, you're asking me to explain. Electromagnetism, using electromagnetism, it's circular. Can't be done. Let me try a different approach. Maybe this will help. You know how you can explain the color blue to someone who can see. You show them the sky, a blue shirt. You give examples, but how do you explain blue to someone blind from birth? You can talk about wavelengths about 450 nanometers. You can describe where it sits between red and green in the spectrum. You can give them all the physics of blue, but none of that conveys the experience, the actual bless. They have to see it. There's no shortcut. Same with magnets, same with electromagnetism. You don't get the intuition from an analogy. You don't get it from a 5-minute explanation. You have to work with the mathematics, solve problems, make calculations, predictions, test them. After months, maybe years of working with electromagnetic theory, something shifts. In your brain, the equations start to feel natural, intuitive, obvious, not because they match your everyday experience, but because you've built a new everyday experience, mathematical. Experience with how fields behave, and then magnets aren't mysterious anymore. They're exactly what you'd expect inevitable consequences of. Charged particles and fields, but you can't shortcut that process. You can't skip to the end. You have to earn the intuition. Now, let me tell you what I can give you. The technical answer. Magnets have magnetic dipole moments, little arrows. Of magnetism, when you align lots of them in the same direction, you get a permanent magnet. Those dipoles create a magnetic field. Configuration that stores potential. Energy. Physical systems naturally evolve toward lower energy states. When two north poles face each other, the energy is high. Moving them apart lowers the energy, so they repel. That's the answer. That's as deep as it goes. You want to know why dipoles create fields? I can tell you about moving charges and electrons spin. You want to know why electrons have spin? I can tell you about the Dirac equation in quantum mechanics. You want to know why the Dirac equation is correct? I can tell you it follows from combining special relativity with quantum mechanics. You want to know why those theories hold? Because they match reality, because we've tested them millions of times and they work. That's it. That's where the chain ends. Here's what you need to understand about how physics actually works. We don't start with philosophy and derive the universe. We start with measurements. We observe patterns. We write equations that describe those patterns. We test those equations against new experiments. When the equations work, when they let us predict things we haven't seen yet. We say we understand the phenomenon. Understanding in physics doesn't mean philosophical satisfaction. It doesn't mean matching your intuition. It means predictive power. It means being able to calculate, to predict, to build. Technology that works by that standard we understand. Electromagnetism better than almost anything. Quantum electrodynamics is tested to incredible precision. We can calculate the magnetic moment of an electron to 11 decimal places in the measurement. Agrees exactly. So when I say I understand magnets, I mean this. I can calculate the force between them. I can predict how they'll behave in different configurations. I can design electric motors, generators, MRI machines. I can manipulate magnetic fields to trap particles or focus beams. That's real understanding. That's what physics offers. Not comfort, not familiar analogies, but power, control over nature. You might not like this answer. You might find it unsatisfying, tough. The universe doesn't owe you an explanation that makes you comfortable. It doesn't owe you a story that matches your intuition about how things should work. Your intuition evolved to throw rocks, pick fruit, and avoid predators. On the African savanna, it did not. Evolved to understand quantum fields or electromagnetic interactions at the atomic scale. So when physics reveals something that violates your intuition, particles acting like waves, time slowing down at high speeds, magnets pushing through empty space, you have two choices. You can reject it as mysterious and unsatisfying and keep asking for better explanations that don't exist, or you can expand your intuition, learn the mathematics, work through the problems, build new mental models based on equations and experiments, not everyday experience. That's what physicists do. None of us found quantum mechanics intuitive at first, but we worked with it long enough that it became familiar, and eventually it started to feel natural, not because it matches common sense, but because we built new common sense, mathematical common sense. So here's what I want you to take away from this. The next time you pick up two magnets and feel them push apart, don't Ask why. Ask how does the force depend on distance? How strong is it compared to gravity? How can I calculate it? How can I use it? Those questions have answers. Good. Answers, precise answers, beautiful. Answers, the why question, the one asking for. Reduction to something more familiar. That question doesn't have an answer, not for magnets, not for any fundamental. Force, because fundamental means exactly that bottom level, nothing underneath. But here's the beautiful thing that people miss when they get stuck on why what physics reveals is that the universe operates according to a small set of rules, the same equations that describe magnets also describe. Lightning, brain signals, computer. Chips, the northern lights chemical. Bonds, why stars shine, why atoms are stable. That's not a failure to explain. That's unification. That's discovering that underneath all. The apparent complexity and chaos of nature. There's a deep structure, a mathematical structure, simple rules with incredibly complex consequences. That's what should blow your mind. Not that we can't reduce magnets to something simpler, but that we can reduce thousands of seemingly different phenomena to the same underlying force you wanted me to explain magnets by, comparing them to something familiar. But I'm telling you something better. Everything familiar is actually magnets, or rather everything is. Electromagnetism, same thing. Your desk, your body, the air, light, chemistry, life itself, it's all different aura. Jimentsov. Electromagnetic interactions, you're not separate from the magnets, you're made of the same force. So was my refusal to answer the BBC interviewer arrogant? No, it was honest. I could have given him a comfortable lie. Magnets are like springs, or think of magnetic fields as rubber sheets, or whatever would have made him nod and feel satisfied, and he would have learned nothing. Instead, I told him the truth. The question itself was broken. The kind of why he wanted doesn't exist. At the fundamental level, things just are. And our job is to describe them accurately, not to reduce them to something more comfortable. People hated that answer, called it evasive, called it a failure to communicate. But they were wrong. Sometimes the most honest answer is the universe doesn't work the way you expect. Your intuitions are wrong. And if you want to understand what's really happening, you need to learn a new way of thinking. That's not arrogance, that's respect. Respect for the truth, respect for the actual structure of reality, and respect for you, for your ability to handle that truth instead of needing a comfortable fiction. So pick up those magnets one more time, feel that invisible push. Now, understand you're feeling one of the four fundamental forces of nature. The same force that makes chemistry work, the same force that makes stars shine, the same force holding you together. Right now. That's not mysterious. Well, the first thing I have to tell you is that you probably have some picture in your head about what antimatter is, and it is probably not quite right. Most people think antimatter is just regular matter with something flipped around, like a mirror image. And that is sort of true, but it misses the really interesting part. You see, the story of antimatter is one of the most beautiful stories in all of physics, because antimatter was not discovered by someone going into a laboratory and finding something strange. No. It was discovered by a man sitting at his desk, staring at equations and finding something that should not be there. Here is what happened. There was a physicist named Dirac, very brilliant fellow, and he was trying to write down the correct equations for how electrons behave. Now, this was in the late 1920s, and people already knew about quantum mechanics, and they knew about relativity, and Dirac wanted to put them together. He wanted an equation that respected both. So he worked and he found the simplest possible equation he could write down. Beautiful equation, very elegant, and it worked wonderfully for describing electrons. But there was a problem. The equation had solutions that made no sense. There were solutions with negative energy. Now, what does that even mean? An electron with negative energy. It sounds like nonsense. And most people would have thrown those solutions away and said, well, the math gives us some garbage. We just ignore the garbage. But Dirac did not do that. Dirac took the crazy answer seriously. He asked, what if these solutions are trying to tell us something? What if nature actually uses these strange solutions? And he made a prediction. He said, there must exist a particle that nobody has ever seen before. A particle exactly like the electron. Same mass, same everything, but with the opposite electrical charge. The electron is negative. This new particle would be positive. He called it the anti-electron. We call it the positron now. And you know what? A few years later, a fellow named Anderson was doing experiments with cosmic rays, particles. That come raining down from outer space, and he found it. He found a particle that curved the wrong way in a magnetic field. It had the mass of an electron, but it curved like it had a positive charge. The positron was real. Dirac predicted it from pure mathematics, and there it was. Now this opens up a whole question. If the electron has an antiparticle, what about the other particles? What about the proton? What about the neutron? And here people get confused. They say, fine, the antiproton has the opposite charge. The proton is positive, the antiproton is negative. I can understand that. But then they ask about the neutron, and they say, wait a minute, the neutron is neutral. It has no charge. So how can it have an antiparticle? What is the opposite of? Nothing. And the answer is very interesting. The rule of the anti is not. Just that it has the opposite charge, that is what everybody thinks, and it is not quite right. The antiparticle has a whole set of properties that are opposite. There are other characteristics that particles carry, besides electrical charge. And when you flip all of those, you get the antiparticle. So yes, there is an antineutron, and the difference is easy to see. You put two neutrons together, nothing special happens. They just stay there, being two neutrons. But you put a neutron and an antineutron together, they annihilate each other. Big explosion of energy. Gamma rays, meson, all kinds of things come flying out. Now, when matter meets antimatter, they do not just react like chemicals mixing together. They annihilate the particles, destroy each other completely. All of their mass, 100% of it, converts directly into energy, into light. Think about that. When you burn wood, a tiny fraction of the mass becomes energy. Most of the stuff is still there as ash and smoke. When a nuclear reaction happens, maybe one of the mass becomes energy. But matter and antimatter, everything, the whole thing, gone, transformed into pure light. And this is not some theoretical idea. This happens in laboratories. You can make positrons. You can see them. You can watch them curve the wrong way between metal plates, and then you watch a positron bump into an electron, and both of them disappear. Two gamma rays come out, carrying all the energy that used to be the mass of those two particles. It is directly observed easily in the laboratory. Now, let me tell you how we really think about this, because so far everything sounds reasonable, strange, but reasonable. Opposite particles that annihilate when they meet, fine. But there is a deeper way to understand what a positron actually is. And it comes from looking carefully at the mathematics. When we calculate what happens with electrons, we draw little diagrams, pictures. Space goes one direction, time goes another direction, and usually we put time going upward, and we draw lines to represent particles moving through space and time. Now there is a mathematical function that tells us the amplitude for an electron to go from one point to another, let us call 1.5, and another 6. The function tells us the amplitude for the electron to go from 5 to 6. If 6 is later in time than 5, everything is normal. The electron goes forward in time. That is what we expect. But what if 6 is earlier than 5? You would hope the mathematics gives 0. You would hope there is no amplitude for an electron to go backward in time. That would be sensible. That would be comfortable. But it is not 0. The mathematics says there is an amplitude for this. And when you look at what this backward going section is like, something very interesting happens. You see the electron carries a charge, and we put arrows on the lines to remember which way it is going. Normally the arrow points forward in time, but in this case the arrow is going the wrong way. And this section going backward in time. It has almost all the same properties as an electron. Same mass, same interactions with light, but it curves the wrong way in a magnetic field. It behaves like it has a positive charge. It is just like an electron, except it is positively charged. It is called a positron, and it really exists. So you see, a positron is not just some separate particle that happens to be opposite to an electron. From this way of looking at it, a positron is what an electron looks like when it is going backward in time. Now let me show you what this means. Imagine an electron moving along through space and time, going forward, doing its thing. Then at some point, it interacts with light, with photons, and something happens. It starts going backward in time. That section going backward, it looks to us like a positron going forward, because we see time flowing in one direction. Then later this backward going section interacts with more light and turns around again. Now it is going forward in time, looking like an electron again. What do we see? We are sitting here watching time go forward like sensible people What do we observe? We see light come in, and suddenly two particles appear that were not there before. An electron and a positron. They exist for a while. Then they come together, annihilate each other, and produce light again. But from the mathematics, there is really just one line going forward, then backward, then forward. Now I want to be very clear about something. This is not philosophy. This is not just a way of talking about it. This is how the calculations actually work. When you compute probabilities using this, picture you get exactly the right answers. The experiments confirm it. So, it turns out that for every particle in nature, there is an antiparticle and. They are connected through this mathematics of going forward and backward in time. Antiroton exist and a proton and an antiproton can come together and annihilate each other, just like the electron and positron. Now here is something practical. When a positron is actually made in the laboratory on Earth, it does not go very far before it disappears. Why? Because the world is full of electrons. The walls are made of atoms, and atoms have electrons in them, so the positron wanders around, bumps into an electron, and they annihilate, gone. 2 gamma rays come out. But if you are clever, you can keep them. You can make positrons go around in a circle using a magnetic field. Keep them away from the walls. Do not let them touch any electrons. And they stay. They stay and they stay and they stay for days, going around in a circle untouched by human hands. In fact, we do experiments by speeding up positrons going around in a circle to very high energy and making electrons go in a circle in the opposite direction, and we look at what happens when they collide with each other. New particles come out. It is one way we discover things. So there is nothing different about a positron than an electron. They are completely symmetrical, same mass, same behavior, except for history, except for the fact that our laboratory, our world, has a lot more electrons than positrons. We have an excess of electrons. Why? Nobody knows. Now let me tell you more about what actually happens when matter and antimatter meet, because this annihilation business is very interesting. When an electron and a positron come together, they annihilate and produce 2 photons, 2 gamma rays, light, and these gamma rays carry away all the energy that used to be the mass of the electron and the positron. But the reverse also happens, and this is very important. If you have a photon with enough energy, it can turn into an electron and a positron, a pair. Out of light, you get matter and antimatter. Think about what this means. Energy can become matter, and not just any matter. It becomes matter and antimatter together, always in pairs. You cannot make an electron without also making a positron. They come together. This is called pair creation, and it happens all the time. Cosmic rays come down from space, hit atoms in the atmosphere, and create pairs of electrons and positrons. In laboratories, we shoot high energy. Photons at targets, and pairs come out. So you see, the universe has this rule: you can convert energy into matter, but you must make equal amounts of matter and antimatter. And you can convert matter back into energy, but only by bringing matter and antimatter together. Now let me tell you how we draw pictures of all this, because the pictures are very useful for understanding what is happening. We draw diagrams. Space goes one way, time goes another way, usually upward. An electron moving through time is a line going up. A positron, which is an electron going backward in time, is a line going down. And a photon, a particle of light, we draw as a wavy line. Now, when an electron and a positron annihilate, what does the diagram look like? You have a line coming up, that is the electron going forward in time. You have a line coming down, that is the positron, which is really an electron going backward in time. They meet at a point, and from that point, wavy lines come out, the photons. But here is the thing from the diagram. You can see that it is really just one line. The electron comes up, reaches the point, and then goes back down. What we call the positron is the same line, just going the other direction in time. And at the point where it turns around, light is emitted or absorbed depending on how you look at it. Now the reverse, process pair creation. A photon comes in, and an electron and positron come out. In the diagram, you have a wavy line coming in, and D from a point, 2 lines come out. One going up the electron, one going down the positron. But again, from the diagram, it is really one line, the electron going up, then turning around, and going down, which looks like a positron going up. So all these processes, annihilation, pair creation, they're all connected. They are all the same thing looked at from different angles. It is just electrons interacting with light and sometimes going forward, in time, sometimes going backward. And the calculations work. When you compute the probabilities for all these processes using these diagrams, you get the right answers. The experiments confirm it. Now, I told you that when a positron is made on Earth, it does not last long because there are electrons everywhere. But there are ways to study them. In the laboratory, we can make beams of positrons. We speed them up using electric fields. We bend them using magnetic fields. And we can see that they bend the opposite way from electrons. Same mass, opposite charge, just as the theory predicts. And we can do something very interesting. We can take positrons and electrons and make them go around in circles in opposite directions very fast, near the speed of light, and then we make them collide with each other. What happens? They annihilate, but because they have so much energy, the photons that come out can immediately create new pairs, not just electrons and positrons, but other particles too, heavier particles, particles we would never see otherwise. This is one of the ways we discover new things about nature. We smash electrons and positrons together and see what comes out. It's like taking two simple things, colliding them and finding out what the universe is made of at a deeper level. It all comes from this idea that positrons exist, that they are electrons going backward in time, that matter and antimatter can annihilate into energy, and energy can create matter and antimatter. Now, if we have anti-electrons, anti-protons, and anti-neutrons, we can in principle make anti-atoms. Think about hydrogen. One proton in the center, positive charge, one electron around it, negative charge. They attract. Very simple. Anti-hydrogen would be one anti-proton in the center, negative charge, one positron around it, positive charge. They attract two, same masses, same forces. Everything works the same. An anti-hydrogen atom would emit the same colors of light as regular hydrogen. Exactly the same. You could not tell the difference just by looking at the light. If you made a whole world out of antimatter, it would work exactly the same as our world. Anti-chemistry would be the same as chemistry. Anti-biology would be the same as biology. People would live their lives and never know they were made of the opposite stuff unless they tried to touch something made of regular matter. Then annihilation. Now this raises a very big question. If matter and antimatter are so symmetrical, if they behave exactly the same way, then when the universe began, there should have been equal amounts of both. But look around. The Earth is made of matter. The sun is made of matter. The stars, the galaxies, everything we can see, matter. Where is the antimatter? Some people thought maybe there are regions of the universe made of antimatter, anti-galaxies far away, and we just cannot tell because the light they emit looks exactly the same. But there is a problem where matter and antimatter regions would meet. There should be annihilation. Lots of it, gamma rays everywhere. We should see this. We look at the sky with gamma ray telescopes, and we do not see the signature of matter and antimatter annihilating at the boundaries. So it seems the universe is almost all matter. The antimatter is missing. Why? How did this happen? If the laws are symmetrical, if every process that makes matter also makes antimatter, how did we end up UI? The more matter, there must be some slight asymmetry, some tiny difference in the laws that we do not fully understand, something that made a little more matter than antimatter in the very beginning. And then what happened? All the antimatter found matter to annihilate with. Almost everything was destroyed, turned into light, but there was a little bit of matter left over, that tiny excess, and that is us. That is everything. We are the leftovers. Everything you see, every star, every planet, every person, we are the small residue that survived the great annihilation at the beginning of the universe. What is that asymmetry? Where does it come from? Nobody knows. This is one of the big unsolved problems. You know, this is how physics is. You discover something beautiful. Antimatter exists. Positrons are electrons going backward in time. Matter and energy can convert into each other. Wonderful. And then you find something you cannot explain. Why is there more matter than antimatter? The universe does not tell us. Not yet. But we keep looking. We do experiments. We smash particles together and see what comes out. We look at the sky. We write equations and see what they predict. And maybe someday somebody will figure it out. Maybe some young person will see something we all miss. That is how it works. That is science. What we know is already remarkable. That there is such a thing as antimatter, that it was predicted from pure mathematics before anyone ever saw it, that every particle has an antiparticle that you can create.
Richard Feynman's IQ was 125, respectable, but unremarkable. At the Manhattan Project, he sat alongside men with IQs over 180. John von Neumann, the mathematician who could perform calculations faster than early computers, IQ estimated at 190. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist directing the entire operation, IQ north of 180. Edward Teller, the hydrogen bomb architect, certified genius by every metric. By every conventional measure, Feynman was the least intelligent person in the room. His 125 IQ came from Far Rockaway High School aptitude testing, a score he mentioned dismissively in later interviews, almost embarrassed by its ordinariness. Yet within months of arriving at Los Alamos in 1943, something peculiar happened. Senior physicists began lining up outside Feynman's office, not because of his credentials, not because of test scores, because when the hardest problems emerged, when equations refused to surrender, when brilliance alone failed, Feynman had answers. That the certified geniuses missed, the reason why destroys everything you believe about intelligence. Society teaches us intelligence is speed, higher IQ, faster processing, quicker pattern recognition. Schools reward those who memorize fastest. Corporations hire from prestigious universities. Online courses promise Master Python in 21 days or Learn AI in 1 weekend. This creates a culture that worships shortcuts and venerates genetic intellectual gifts. Walk into any tech company and listen to engineers compete over algorithm speed, prestigious degrees, LeetCode code scores solved under time pressure. The message is clear: fast equals smart. This produces a specific problem. Speed without understanding creates brittle knowledge. Fast thinking misses deep patterns. Credentials substitute for capability. You can memorize React syntax from tutorials and still freeze when the framework updates. You can hold AWS certifications and panic when systems fail in unexpected ways. You can test at genius level and plateau while slower thinkers advance past you. The high IQ trap is real, documented, and career-destroying. Feynman did the opposite. He thought slower. He rebuilt concepts from scratch. He refused to memorize formulas that other physicists accepted as settled truth. While colleagues raced ahead, Feynman stayed behind, reconstructing, questioning, playing with ideas like a child assembles blocks. This approach looked inefficient. His professors worried. His peers dismissed him as plodding. But this produced a different result: deep, transferable understanding that worked across any problem. Slow thinking that outlasted fast intelligence. As documented in James Gleick's biography, Genius, The Life and Science of Richard Feynman, this wasn't personality quirk. It was deliberate method, practiced across 5 decades, refined into a system that beat genetic advantage every single time. To understand how someone with a merely good IQ beats certified geniuses, we need to see what he actually did differently, not what he had. What he practiced. MIT, 1939. Feynman is a graduate student in theoretical physics. The standard path is clear. Attend lectures, memorize equation tables, reference known solutions from textbooks, publish papers that extend existing work incrementally. The students around him, many with higher IQs, stronger test scores, better undergraduate credentials, follow this path efficiently. They check textbooks immediately when assigned problems. They memorize standard techniques. They optimize for speed. Feynman refuses. His advisor, John Wheeler, assigns him a quantum electrodynamics problem involving particle interactions. Other graduate students solve it in hours by checking reference materials. Feynman sits with blank notebooks. He spends 3 full days deriving the answer from scratch, starting from Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism and building upward, line by line, refusing to skip steps or reference shortcuts. Wheeler notices something unusual. Feynman's final solution differs slightly from the textbook answer, but it's correct. More importantly, Feynman can now solve any related problem because he understands the foundation. When Wheeler assigns variations, Feynman adapts instantly. The textbook memorizers can only solve problems identical to examples they have seen. New configurations break them. This reveals something about how intelligence actually works. High IQ provides faster pattern matching against existing templates stored in memory. But physics problems don't repeat exactly. They mutate, variables shift, context change, memorization breaks, reconstruction adapts. Feynman later explained his approach in "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman." I had a scheme which I still use today when somebody is explaining something that I'm trying to understand. I keep making up examples. Not memorizing their examples, creating his own. This forces reconstruction rather than recognition. While high IQ, students optimized for speed, memorizing proven formulas. Feynman optimized for understanding, reconstructing logic chains from axioms. His slowness was actually depth. He spent 3 days where others spent 3 hours. But those 3 days built a mental model that worked for 3 decades. The fast students had to rememorize for every new problem type, constantly updating their mental libraries. Feynman never had to update. His foundation didn't change because it was built from principles, not patterns. The same principle applies today when you're learning to code. If you memorize PyTorch syntax from tutorials, you'll freeze when the library updates or when you need TensorFlow instead. If you reconstruct how neural networks actually work from calculus and linear algebra fundamentals, you'll adapt to any framework. The fast path looks efficient initially. The slow path compounds over years. When you're studying for technical certifications, AWS, Azure, Kubernetes, the choice is identical. Memorize enough to pass the test, and you'll struggle with real-world scenarios the certification didn't cover. Understand the underlying distributed systems principles, and you'll solve problems the test writers never imagined. Feynman's method: refuse the shortcut. Build from ground zero. Think slower. Understand deeper. But reconstruction alone doesn't explain how he beat 180 IQ physicists. There's a second pattern, visible at Los Alamos. The Manhattan Project assembles the highest IQ concentration in human history. Von Neumann focuses on explosive lens calculations. Oppenheimer manages theoretical divisions. Teller pursues hydrogen bomb side projects. Senior physicists compete for prestigious assignments, bomb design calculations, theoretical papers that will secure post-war academic positions, work that carries historical weight. Feynman, the youngest group leader and lowest credentialed physicist, chooses differently. He volunteers for tedious problems that others avoid, checking calculations line by line, debugging integration errors, tutoring military technicians who lack physics backgrounds, working through simple mechanical problems that senior scientists consider beneath them. His colleagues see this as career suicide. Why waste time on computational grunt work when you could be advancing theoretical frontiers? But Feynman understands something they miss. These boring problems force him to understand every aspect of bomb physics. While von Neumann focuses narrowly on one mathematical specialty, Feynman learns everything: neutron diffusion, compression dynamics, detonation timing, metallurgy constraints, engineering tolerances. The high IQ specialists become experts in fragments. Feynman becomes expert in the complete system. Within 6 months, the consequences emerge. Integration problems arise, moments when separate systems must work together, and conflicts appear. Von Neumann's lens calculations conflict with Teller's. Compression estimates. Oppenheimer's theoretical models clash with engineering realities. Each specialist understands their piece perfectly, but can't see how pieces interconnect. Feynman sees it, not because his IQ is higher, because his problem selection strategy built broader, deeper models. Hans Bethe, the theoretical division leader, and himself a Nobel laureate, starts routing the hardest integration problems to Feynman, rather than to higher credentialed physicists. As documented in Richard Rhodes' The Making of the Atomic Bomb, Bethe considered Feynman more valuable than specialists with superior test scores, because Feynman could cross boundaries that specialization created. This reveals a second principle. High IQ creates confidence in speed, which produces credential hunting, chasing prestigious problems, high-status assignments, impressive-sounding expertise that looks good on CVs. Feynman's method was opposite. Choose problems for learning, not status. Work on boring. Problems that teach fundamentals. Avoid narrow specialization that produces fragile expertise. This wasn't modesty, it was strategy. While 180 IQ physicists optimized for short-term prestige, papers, recognition, post-war positions, Feynman optimized for long-term capability. The result? When novel problems emerged, specialists were helpless outside their domains. Feynman adapted, not because his brain processed faster, because his learning strategy was wiser. The same principle applies when you're building career skills today. If you chase impressive-sounding roles, senior AI architect, principal blockchain engineer, without understanding fundamentals, you'll panic when technology shifts. These titles look spectacular on LinkedIn, but produce brittle expertise. If you deliberately work on boring foundation problems, data structures, system design, database internals, networking protocols, you build transferable mastery that works across any technology wave. When preparing for career transitions, the choice is identical. Don't optimize for what sounds impressive in job descriptions. Optimize for what teaches complete systems. The senior engineers who survive technology disruptions aren't those with the most prestigious past titles. They're those who understand foundations deeply enough to rebuild expertise in new domains. Work the problems others avoid because they seem tedious. That's where real understanding hides. But there's a third pattern, visible after the war. Cornell University, 1945. World War II ends. Physicists race to publish in the new quantum electrodynamics field. Speed matters. First publication wins credit, academic positions, research funding. The competition is fierce and explicit. Julian Schwinger, a physicist with IQ over 180 and Harvard pedigree, publishes complex mathematical papers quickly. His work is impressive, rigorously proven, mathematically elegant. It wins him immediate recognition and Nobel Prize consideration. But there's a problem. Almost nobody can understand or use Schwinger's equations. They're technically correct, but conceptually opaque. Only specialists can follow his logic. Feynman does the opposite. He spends 4 years developing his diagrams, simple pictures that represent particle interactions visually rather than mathematically. His colleagues grow impatient. Why waste time drawing pictures when Schwinger already solved the problem with equations? Publish or perish. The pressure builds. Feynman refuses to publish until he achieves perfect conceptual clarity. Not mathematical rigor. Schwinger already has that. Clarity. The ability for any physics student to grasp the underlying logic without specialized training. 4 years of refinement, simplification, playing with visual representations until complexity dissolves. Feynman finally publishes his diagrams. The physics community discovers something remarkable. Feynman's pictorial method and Schwinger's mathematical method produce identical predictions. Both are correct. But Feynman's method is teachable. Within years, every physics graduate student learns Feynman diagrams. Schwinger's equations remain historical footnotes studied only by specialists. Both men win the Nobel Prize in 1965 for the same discovery. But Schwinger's work dies with his generation. Feynman's diagrams become the standard method taught worldwide for 75 years and counting. Not because Feynman was smarter, because he prioritized clarity over complexity, simplicity over sophistication, teaching over impressing. In the Feynman Lectures on Physics, he articulated this philosophy. I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level. That means we really don't understand it. This wasn't false modesty. It was epistemological standard. Understanding means ability to explain simply. If explanation requires jargon and complexity, the explainer doesn't truly understand. They are hiding behind sophisticated language. High IQ produces fast, complex articulation, formulaic elegance, mathematical sophistication. This impresses peer reviewers, but obscures understanding. Schwinger optimized for impressiveness, complex equations that signal intelligence to academic committees. Feynman optimized for clarity, simple pictures that signal understanding to students. The market rewarded Schwinger's short term. He got prestigious positions, rapid publication, immediate recognition. Reality rewarded Feynman long term. His work became foundational. His method became universal. His legacy outlasted every rival. This reveals a third principle: speed and complexity signal intelligence. Slowness and clarity signal mastery. The system rewards the former. Reality rewards the latter. The same principle applies when you're explaining your expertise today. If you use jargon and complex frameworks to sound smart in stakeholder meetings, you signal intelligence but hide ignorance. Anyone can make simple things complex. Mastery is making complex things simple. If you optimize presentations for impressiveness, dense slides, technical terminology, sophisticated models, you win short-term credibility from people who don't understand the domain. If you optimize for clarity, visual diagrams, plain language, concrete examples, you win long-term influence from people who need to act on your insights. When learning any new field, force yourself to explain concepts simply. If you can't draw the idea, you don't understand it. If you need jargon, you're hiding. Feynman's 4-year delay wasn't procrastination. It was the discipline of mastery, refusing to move forward until understanding was complete. But why did this work? What happens when you combine these three patterns? When you combine first principles reconstruction, plus deliberate problem selection, plus conceptual clarity, you get something more powerful than high IQ. You get method. Transferable, systematic, improvable method that compounds over decades. This is why Feynman won the Nobel Prize, not because his IQ was highest, but because his method was deepest. While faster minds chase speed, Feynman chased understanding. While certified geniuses competed for prestigious problems, Feynman chose problems for learning. While complex thinkers impressed peer reviewers, Feynman simplified until clarity emerged. The result: his diagrams became universal language spoken by every physicist worldwide. His lectures became the gold standard of pedagogy, still used 60 years later. His problem-solving approach outlived every high IQ rival who burned out, specialized into irrelevance, or published work that died with their generation. But this reveals something deeper about intelligence itself. Intelligence is not fixed capacity. It's not genetic lottery determined by childhood test scores. Intelligence is method multiplied by consistent practice over time. Von Neumann had IQ 190. He could multiply 4-digit numbers instantly in his head, speak 7 languages, fluently recall entire books from memory. By every measure, he was the most intelligent human of his generation. He died at 53. Most of his work became obsolete within 2 decades. His contributions, while real, didn't reshape their fields. Feynman had IQ 125, merely above average. Good, not exceptional. He died at 69. His work defines physics education 40 years after his death. His diagrams remain the standard method. His lectures remain the standard pedagogy. His approach to thinking remains the model for how science should be practiced. Not because he was smarter, because he thought better. Freeman Dyson, a physicist who knew both men, wrote that Feynman's genius wasn't intellectual horsepower. It was the power to see things simply, to strip away unnecessary complications and get to the heart of the matter. This power came from method, not genetics. The system worships IQ because IQ is easy to measure. Tests need scalability. Institutions need sorting mechanisms, credentials. It's signal intelligence because employers need hiring shortcuts. This entire apparatus optimizes for speed, fast pattern matching, quick recall, rapid processing. But reality doesn't care about speed. Reality rewards understanding. In his final years, Feynman wrote on his Caltech blackboard, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." This sentence contains his entire method. Understanding means ability to reconstruct from nothing. If you can't build it from first principles, you don't understand it. You've only memorized someone else's understanding. You don't need a high IQ to practice this method. You need patience to think slower, humility to choose boring problems that teach fundamentals, discipline to simplify until clarity emerges. These are practices, not gifts. Learnable, improvable, systematic. The education system will never teach this because education optimizes for credential production, not understanding cultivation. Schools need grades, tests, rankings. This requires speed and standardization. Feynman's method is slow and individualized. It doesn't scale to classroom management. It doesn't produce neat percentile rankings. But for individuals learning on their own terms, it's available completely. When you study technical documentation, resist the urge to copy-paste code examples. Reconstruct the logic yourself from first principles. When you prepare for career transitions, avoid chasing impressive titles. Choose projects that teach complete systems, even if they seem tedious. When you explain your expertise, simplify relentlessly until non-experts understand. If you can't draw it simply, you don't truly understand it yet. Think slower. You'll understand deeper. Over years, depth beats speed every time. Over decades, method beats genetics consistently. Feynman proved this across 50 years of physics. His 125 IQ didn't limit him. It liberated him. Without the arrogance that fast intelligence produces, he stayed curious about basic questions. Without the credential addiction that high achievers suffer, he chose learning over status. Without the complexity trap that geniuses fall into, he simplified until truth emerged visible to everyone. This is available to you, not genetic gifts, not standardized test scores, not prestigious degrees. Just method, reconstruct concepts from scratch until you can build them yourself. Choose boring problems that others avoid because they teach foundational systems. Simplify relentlessly until you can explain ideas so clearly that beginners grasp them immediately. The path is slow, the results compound, and intelligence, it turns out, is less about the brain you were born with and more about the method you practice daily.
I'm going to teach you a trick, right now, right here. And this trick, this single technique will change how your brain works forever. Not gradually, not eventually, instantly. Pause for effect. You're going to walk out of here today with a completely different relationship to learning, to thinking, to understanding. You'll never approach a problem the same way again. Sound too good to be true. I thought so too. But then I studied Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, revolutionary physicist, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, and I discovered something shocking. His genius wasn't mystical. It wasn't genetic. It wasn't luck. It was a trick, a simple, repeatable, learnable trick that he used on everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Physics, obviously, but also biology, art, music, safecracking, whatever caught his attention. Aid, lean in heats, and the most beautiful part. Once you learn this trick, you can use it immediately on anything, and you'll feel your brain unlock in real time. I'm going to prove it to you. By the end of this talk, you're going to use this trick yourself, and you're going to experience what it feels like when your brain suddenly gets smarter. Ready? Let's go. But as we walk across stage, first, let me show you what this trick is now. It's not about reading faster. It's not about memorizing more. It's not about studying harder or longer or with more focus. All of those things might help, but they're not the trick. The trick is about something else entirely. Something that most people never discover because the entire education system is designed to prevent you from learning it. Let me tell you a story that reveals everything. Share this with intensity. It's 1961. Feynman is at Caltech. He's already famous. Nobel Prize, revolutionary work, legendary teacher. And a student comes to him with a question. Professor Feynman, can you explain why spin 1/2 particles obey Fermi, Dirac statistics? Now, this is standard quantum mechanics. Any physics professor knows this. There's a textbook answer. There's a derivation. There's an explanation that everyone gives. And you know what Feynman says? I'll prepare a freshman lecture on it. Let me break it down to that level. The student is confused. A freshman lecture. This is advanced quantum mechanics. But Feynman is serious. He goes away to work on it. Pause, slow down now, and a few days later he comes back. And he says something that changes everything. I couldn't do it. I couldn't explain it simply enough. Which means we don't really understand it. Alright, let that land on. Do you hear what just happened? A Nobel Prize winner, one of the smartest humans alive, just admitted he doesn't really understand something. Not because he can't do the math. Not because he doesn't know the equations. But because he can't explain it simply. And in that moment, Feynman revealed the trick, the technique that made him a genius, the method that unlocked his brain power. Direct statement. If you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it. That's not just a nice saying. That's not motivational fluff. That's the trick. That's the entire method, right there. But here's where it gets interesting. Most people hear that quote and they nod and they move on. Yeah, explain things simply. Got it. But they don't actually do it. They don't understand what it means. They don't realize this is the most powerful cognitive technique ever discovered. Tasks are get intensive. So let me break it down for you. Let me show you exactly how this trick works and why it unlocks your brain instantly. When you try to explain something simply, when you force yourself to use plain language, no jargon, no technical terms, as if you're teaching a child, something amazing happens in your brain. You can't hide anymore. Explain this, see. Most of the time, we fool ourselves about what we understand. We read something, we nod along, we think, okay, that makes sense. We hear an explanation, we recognize the words, we assume we get it. But we don't. We're confusing familiarity with understanding. We're mistaking recognition for comprehension. And our brain lets us get away with it. Because our brain is comfortable with surface-level knowledge. It doesn't want to do the hard work of real understanding. But when you try to explain something simply, you can't fake it. You can't hide behind complexity. You can't use jargon to mask confusion. Ace your gestures. You either understand it well enough to make it clear or you don't. There's no middle ground. And the moment you try to explain something and get stuck, the moment you realize, wait, I can't actually explain this part clearly, that's the moment your brain unlocks. Because now you know exactly what you don't understand. You've exposed the gap. You found the edge of your knowledge. And make the point. And that's where learning happens. Not in the comfortable areas where you already understand, but at the edges, at the gaps, where you get stuck. This is the trick. Use simple explanation as a diagnostic tool, as a way to reveal what you don't actually understand yet. Let me show you this in action. Share this example. Let's say you're trying to learn about compound interest. You've heard about it. You know it's important. You've maybe even seen the formula. Most people stop there. They think they understand compound interest. They could probably pass a test on it. But do they really understand it? Let's use Feynman's trick. Hey, do this, Liv. Explain compound interest to me like I'm 10 years old. No formulas. No fancy words. Just simple explanation. You start, well, compound interest is when you earn interest on your interest. Why? Wait, what's interest? Explain interest without using the word interest. It's money that grows. Why does it grow? Who makes it grow? Where does it come from? Pause, we see what's happening. You thought you understood compound interest. But when you try to explain it simply, you realize there are gaps. Pieces you can't articulate. Concepts you can't make clear. That's not failure. That's the trick working. You just revealed what you need to learn. Continue the example. So you go back. You think about it, you break it down. And you try again. Okay? Imagine you give someone $100 to hold for you. And they say thank you by giving you $10 extra at the end of the year. So now you have $110. The next year, you let them hold all $110, and they give you 10% again. But this time, 10% of 110 is $11, so you end up with 121. Each year, you're getting 10% of a bigger amount, so your money grows faster and faster. That's compound interest. Snap, now you understand it, not because you memorized the formula, but because you can explain it to a child. You've built real understanding. That's the trick. That's how it works. Here's the direct address, and here's the magic. The moment you successfully explain something simply, your brain has undergone a transformation. You don't just understand that one concept better. You've strengthened your ability to understand everything better, because you've taught your brain to demand real understanding, not surface knowledge. Now let me show you why this works so powerfully. Why this technique unlocks your brain in a way that other learning methods don't. Explain the neuroscience side thing. When you just read something or hear something, your brain does minimal processing. It recognizes patterns. It stores information superficially. It creates weak, fragile connections. But when you try to explain something, when you have to retrieve the information, organize it, translate it into your own words, find examples, anticipate questions, your brain does deep processing. It's like the difference between looking at a map and actually walking the route. Looking at the map gives you surface familiarity. Walking the route builds deep spatial understanding. Make it concrete. Every time you explain something simply, you're forcing your brain to retrieve the information from memory. Active recall. The most powerful learning technique. Organize it logically, building structured understanding, not random facts. Translate it into simple language, ensuring you understand the concepts, not just the words. Find analogies and examples, connecting new knowledge to existing knowledge. Anticipate confusion, identifying where the explanation might break down. Use or gesture widely. That's 5 different cognitive processes happening simultaneously, all of them strengthening your understanding, all of them building real, permanent knowledge. No other learning technique does all of this at once. That's why this trick is so powerful. Tell this story. Feynman used this trick his entire life, not just on physics, on everything. Someone asks him about art. He doesn't just say, "I like art." He explains, art is interesting because the artist is trying to show you something about how they see the world. The colors they choose, the shapes they emphasize, the details they include or leave out, all of that tells you what they think is important. Looking at art is like reading someone's mind through pictures.
Exposit are simple.
Clear. A 10-year-old could understand it, and in making it that clear, Feynman had to really understand art himself, not just appreciate it, understand it. Someone asks him why the sky is blue. He doesn't say, "Rayleigh scattering." He says, "Sunlight is made of all different colors mixed together. When that light hits air molecules, the blue colors bounce around more than the other colors. So when you look at the sky, you're seeing all that bounced blue light. That's why the sky looks blue and sunsets look red. You're seeing the light that didn't get bounced away." Thus, point Gaussian again, simple, clear. And in the process of making it simple, Feynman had to deeply understand the physics of light and scattering and make the connection. This is what the trick does. It forces you to understand deeply so you can explain simply. And that deep understanding is what unlocks your brain power. Now let me give you the exact process. The step-by-step method you can use starting today. Present this clearly. Step 1, choose something you want to understand. Anything, a concept from work, something you're studying, an idea you find interesting, doesn't matter what, pick it. Step 2, get a blank piece of paper, or open a blank document, or just speak out loud. Whatever works for you, but make it blank, no notes, no references, just you and the blank page. Step 3, right at the top. How I would explain this to a 12-year-old. Why 12? Because 12-year-olds are smart enough to understand real concepts, but they don't know any jargon. They need plain language, clear examples, simple logic. I continue the steps. Step 4, start explaining. Write or speak everything you know about the topic. Use simple words, short sentences, clear examples. Pretend you're talking to an actual kid. Step 5, notice where you get stuck. This is crucial. Pay attention to the moments where you can't explain something clearly, where you want to use a technical term but can't define it, where the logic gets fuzzy, where you're not sure why something works. Those stuck points, that's gold. That's where you don't really understand yet. Emphasize this. The step 6, go back to the source material. But here's the key, don't just read everything. Focus specifically on the parts where you got stuck. Study only those pieces. Break them down. Think them through. Step 7, try explaining again. With your new understanding, see if you can get past the stuck points. Step 8, repeat steps 5 through 7 until you can explain the entire concept simply, from start to finish with no stuck points. A pause, that's it. 8 steps. You can do this entire process in 20 minutes for a simple concept, an hour for something complex. But when you're done, you don't just sort of understand the concept, you really understand it, deeply, permanently. Moch, share a powerful example. Let me tell you about someone who used this trick and had their brain unlock in real time. I was teaching a workshop, and there's this woman there, let's call her Sarah, who's a marketing manager, smart person, successful career. But she tells me she feels like she's hit a ceiling. She keeps getting passed over for promotions to director level. I ask her, "Can you explain your company's marketing strategy to me like I'm 12? She starts, "Well, we do integrated campaigns across multiple channels to drive engagement and conversions through a data-driven approach that leverages customer insights to optimize our funnel metrics." Pose. Let the jargon sink in. I stop her. I'm 12. I don't know what any of those words mean. Try again. Well, she's frustrated. But that's how we talk about it at work. That's the strategy. Maybe. But do you understand it? Estin continue the story. She thinks. She tries again. And she gets stuck. She realizes she can explain the tactics. We post on social media, we send emails, we buy ads, but she can't explain the strategy, the why behind the what, the logic connecting it all. So she goes back, she thinks about it, really thinks about it. And 2 days later, she sends me an email. Holy shit. I just realized I've been doing marketing for 5 years and I didn't really understand marketing strategy. I could execute tactics, but I didn't understand the underlying principles, so I couldn't think strategically. No wonder they wouldn't promote me to director. Directors need to think strategically, and I was just executing tactically. Make the point, she used the trick. It revealed the gaps in her understanding. She filled those gaps. And 6 months later, she got promoted. Not because she worked harder, not because she learned more facts, but because she went from surface understanding to deep understanding. And that showed up in everything she did. That's what this trick does. It doesn't just help you understand one thing better. It transforms how you understand everything. Get practical. Now let me address some questions I know you're thinking. First, what if I'm trying to learn something really complicated? Can I really explain quantum mechanics or molecular biology or advanced mathematics to a 12-year-old? Yes. And if you can't, you don't understand it well enough yet. Explain Heaths. Feynman could explain quantum mechanics to undergraduates. Einstein could explain relativity to journalists. The best thinkers in any field can make complex ideas accessible, not by dumbing them down, but by understanding them so deeply they can find the simple truth underneath the complexity. If you can't do that, you haven't reached deep understanding yet. And that's okay. That's what the trick reveals. That's what you work toward. Another question. Second question. What if my field requires technical language? What if I can't explain my work without jargon? Then you don't understand your work as well as you think. Be direct. A technical language is useful for precise communication between experts. But if you can't also explain the same concepts in plain language, you're using jargon as a crutch. You're hiding behind complexity. The best professionals in any field can switch between technical language and plain language effortlessly, because they understand the concepts, not just the terminology. Third question. Isn't this time consuming? Don't I learn slower if I have to explain everything simply? In the moment. Yes. Over time, no. Asaka explained the paradox. When you just read something quickly, you feel like you're learning fast. You cover lots of material. You feel productive. But a week later, you've forgotten most of it. A month later, it's gone. You have to learn it again. When you use Feynman's trick, you learn slower in the moment, but you remember longer. You understand deeper. You can apply it more flexibly. So which is actually faster? Learning something 5 times superficially, or learning it once deeply? Make it personal, Ping. I'll tell you from experience, I used to be a fast learner. I'd read a book in a day, take a course in a weekend, consume information rapidly, and I couldn't understand why nothing stuck, why I'd forget everything, why I couldn't apply what I'd learned. Then I discovered Feynman's trick, and everything changed. Now I learn slower. I spend more time with less material. I explain things simply to myself constantly, and I remember everything. I can apply concepts years later. I make connections between different domains. My understanding compounds over time instead of evaporating. Slow learning is fast learning. The trick makes you slower in the moment and faster over time. Now let me show you how to practice this trick. How to make it a habit that transforms your brain permanently. I share this method every day. Pick one thing you encountered that day. Could be from work, could be from reading, could be from a conversation, could be from a video you watched, doesn't matter. Take 5 minutes and explain it simply. Out loud, or in writing, or to someone else. Force yourself to make it clear enough for a kid to understand. That's it. 5 minutes a day. One concept a day. I explain what happens. At first, this will feel hard. You'll get stuck a lot. You'll realize how much you don't really understand. But over time, over weeks and months, something shifts. You start noticing gaps in your understanding immediately. You start thinking in simple explanations naturally. You start demanding deep understanding from yourself automatically. Your brain rewires itself. The trick becomes your default mode of thinking. Share the transformation. And when that happens, everything changes. Conversations become learning opportunities because you're constantly testing your understanding. Meetings become clearer because you demand simple explanations from others. Problems become easier because you understand them at a deeper level. You don't just know more, you understand better, and that's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Let me give you one more story. This one is about Feynman himself, and it shows the trick at its most powerful. I'll tell this with admiration. It's the 1980s. The Space Shuttle Challenger explodes. NASA's investigating. They've assembled a presidential commission with famous people, military leaders, bureaucrats, smart people, important people, and they bring in Feynman as a token physicist, someone to rubber stamp their findings. But Feynman doesn't play that game. He starts investigating, really investigating, and he keeps asking simple questions. How cold was it that morning? What happens to the O-rings when they get cold? Can you show me an O-ring? That should build the tension. The NASA engineers give him complicated explanations. Technical jargon, complex systems, everyone's nodding along. But Feynman keeps asking, but what actually happens? Can you explain it simply? And they can't. They know the technical details, but they don't really understand the physics of what's happening. So Feynman does an experiment. Live, during a public hearing, he takes a piece of O-ring material. He puts it in ice water. He shows how it becomes brittle and stops sealing. Masser deliver the conclusion, one simple demonstration, one clear explanation, and suddenly everyone understands what went wrong. The O-rings got too cold. They failed to seal. The shuttle exploded. NASA had all the technical data, all the smart engineers, all the complex analysis. But they couldn't see the simple truth until Feynman made it clear. Make the point. That's the power of this trick. It cuts through complexity. It exposes what's really happening. It reveals truth. And you have that power now. Every time you demand simple explanation from yourself or from others, you're wielding that power. I just get emotional. Let me tell you what this trick has meant to me personally. Because this isn't just academic for me. This changed my life. I used to think I was a mediocre thinker. I could memorize stuff, I could pass tests. But I didn't feel smart. I felt like everyone else just naturally understood things I had to work hard to grasp. Then I discovered Feynman's trick, and I realized nobody naturally understands things. Some people just process deeply without realizing it, and most people process superficially and fool themselves into thinking they understand. That's their personal revelation. Once I started using this trick, once I started demanding simple explanations from myself, I stopped being mediocre. Not because I got smarter, but because I started actually understanding instead of just recognizing. Problems I couldn't solve before became solvable. Concepts I couldn't grasp became clear. Connections I couldn't see became obvious. My brain unlocked, and it can happen for you too. Direct challenges. So here's what I want you to do. Right now, before you leave, before you forget, take out your phone, or a piece of paper, or just think it through out loud. Pick something you think you understand, something from your work, or from something you're studying, or from a conversation you had recently, and try to explain it simply, like you're talking to a 12-year-old. Use plain language, clear examples, no jargon. Pause it. Do it now. I'll wait. Give them a moment. Did you get stuck? Did you hit a point where you couldn't explain something clearly? Where you wanted to use a technical term but couldn't define it? A point. That's the trick working. You just discovered what you don't really understand yet, and now you know exactly where to focus your learning. That feeling, that moment of realization, that's your brain unlocking. That's you seeing the edge of your knowledge. That's you about to grow. A build to conclusion. Feynman once said, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. Most people spend their lives collecting names, terms, credentials, labels. They sound smart, they look educated, but they don't understand. Feynman spent his life knowing things, really knowing them, deeply understanding them, being able to explain them to anyone. Slow down, and the trick, the technique that made this possible, was simple explanation. Constantly demanding that he could make complex ideas clear, constantly testing his understanding against the standard of can a child understand this? That's the trick. That's the whole method, right there. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it. And the moment you try to explain it and get stuck, you've found where you need to learn. For final challenges, so use this trick. Today, tomorrow, every day, on everything you want to understand. Make it a habit. Make it automatic. Make it your default mode of thinking. Demand simple explanation from yourself. Demand it from others. Don't accept complexity as a substitute for understanding. And watch what happens. Watch your brain unlock. Watch your understanding deepen. Watch yourself become the thinker you're capable of being. Pause, smile this. Because here's the secret. You're not limited by your intelligence. You're limited by your methods. And now you have Feynman's method. The question isn't whether this trick works. The question is, will you use it? Walk to center stage A. I showed you the trick. I proved it works. I gave you the exact process. I challenged you to try it right now. The rest is up to you. Will you go back to surface level learning? Or will you demand deep understanding? Will you accept complexity? Or will you insist on clarity? Will you fool yourself about what you know? Or will you use this trick to reveal the truth? 5 final statement. The trick is simple. But simple doesn't mean easy. It means powerful. It means it works. It means it can transform your brain starting right now. Use it. Trust it. Watch it unlock your brain power instantly. Pause to say thank you. Beep. And if you want to go deeper into Feynman's techniques, if you want more methods, more insights, more ways to unlock your brain power, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to the Mind of Richard Feynman channel. We're breaking down exactly how one of history's greatest minds worked with techniques you can apply immediately. Join us. Let's unlock our brains together. See you in the next one.
Close your eyes for a moment and go back in time. Picture a 2-year-old child. No grammar, no dictionary, no verb charts, yet somehow they learn an entire language without ever studying. How is that possible? The secret isn't in the words, it's in how the brain is used, and that's exactly what polyglots have mastered. They don't study a language, they recreate the experience of being a child learning again. It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Their minds aren't trapped by rules. They're focused on absorbing living patterns, real, emotional, human context. Before we go deeper, hit the like button. And now listen carefully. The brain doesn't learn what it's forced to. It learns what it feels. Every new word must be connected to an emotion, an image, a moment. That's how a language stops being a chain of sounds and becomes an extension of who you are. The mistake most people make is trying to learn like logical adults, when the secret is to relearn like curious children. Polyglots don't worry about being right. They focus on sounding natural. They don't memorize isolated words. They surround themselves with living context. They listen to real conversations, watch scenes, observe gestures, and let the brain connect everything on its own. They don't translate everything because translation slows the mind. It builds a bridge where there should be fusion. They embrace the discomfort of not understanding it all because that discomfort is the brain building new connections. And most importantly, they don't wait for the perfect moment to start speaking. They speak incorrectly on purpose because mistakes are the gym of the mind. Every time you say something wrong and correct yourself, your brain locks in the right form 10 times stronger. It's like carving a diamond. Not one perfect strike, but the sum of thousands that shapes brilliance. The mind of a polyglot doesn't seek perfection, it seeks rhythm. And rhythm is born when learning becomes part of your life, not just part of your study routine.
Now, I want you to write in the comments, "My mind is ready to learn."
When you write that, you send a direct message to your subconscious, declaring that you're ready to change. Now imagine your mind as fertile soil. Everything you plant in it grows. The problem is, most people plant the wrong seeds. When you say, "I'm bad at languages," the brain doesn't argue, it obeys. When you repeat, "This is hard," it builds resistance. But when you say, "I learn," something shifts. The brain begins to reorganize itself. Polyglots understand this intuitively. They train the mind like a muscle through small daily repetitions, with consistency, not desperate effort. They create a mental micro-world in the new language. They change their phone settings, think in simple phrases, narrate what they're doing. Je bois de l'eau. Estoy abriendo la puerta. It sounds trivial, but it's profoundly powerful. Because every time you name the world, the language stops being foreign and starts becoming yours. They repeat small stories and patterns until the brain automates.
just like hearing a song so many times that suddenly you can sing it without thinking. They use what's called massive comprehensible input, consuming material just slightly above their level, listening and watching until the language feels familiar. School taught you to fear mistakes, but the brilliant mind uses them as a map. This isn't about memorizing phrases. It's about creating sensations. When learning becomes sensory, language stops being studied and starts being lived. And here lies the difference that changes everything. Schools teach you to understand a language, but polyglots learn to think inside it.
When you think inside a language, it's no longer translation, it's pure thought. At that point, you're not speaking French, Spanish, or any other language. You are French, you are Spanish, as you speak. That's what awakens the brain, the feeling of, I'm inside this. That's why some people learn in months what others take years to grasp. Listen to me carefully now, because this is where learning stops being effort and becomes intelligence. There's a principle few people know, and it completely changes how the brain locks a language in place. You only truly understand something when you can explain it simply. I call this the reverse teaching method. Polyglots do this instinctively. They learn a new structure, for example, j'ai attendu, and instead of just repeating it, they try to teach themselves what it really means. They think, this is like saying, I've been waiting for a while. But look how this language builds time differently. Interesting. In that instant, the brain stops repeating and starts reorganizing the logic of the language. That's where learning becomes irreversible. When you explain something, even if it's to your reflection, you're forcing your brain to build new connections, to translate chaos into clarity. The result? You stop memorizing and begin understanding from the inside out. That's the difference between speaking a language and thinking in one. If you want to apply this in practice, start small. With every new word or phrase, create a tiny explanation. Speak out loud, even if it feels strange. Imagine you're teaching someone invisible in front of you. Record yourself for 1 minute a day, teaching a new structure. At first, it may feel silly, but it's powerful. Your brain starts storing the language not as sound, but as concept. And that's how fluency is born. Because true fluency isn't speed in speaking, it's clarity in thinking.
The more you teach yourself, the more your brain believes that knowledge is essential for survival, and keeps it. This is pure neuroscience in action, but with the simplicity of a child. It's a return to the original curiosity, the same kind of thinking children use to discover the world. Now imagine something even deeper. You don't learn a language, you become someone who speaks that language. That's what I call the identity shift technique. The fastest polyglots in the world don't try to learn Spanish or learn French. They become Spanish or French on the inside. It's an identity shift, not just a vocabulary expansion. When you adopt the mental role of someone who already speaks the language, the brain stops translating and starts behaving as if it were already fluent. This happens because you activate the same neural system used when imitating behavior. The brain doesn't distinguish learning from acting. It believes in the role you play. That's why the secret is to live as if. Choose 1 hour a day to inhabit this new version of yourself. During that hour, think, narrate, react, dream, and speak, only in the new language. If it's French, talk to yourself like someone calm, expressive, and curious. Je suis là. Je comprends. Je peux le faire. If it's Spanish, use the energy, the rhythm, the warmth of the language. Estoy aprendiendo. Estoy viviendo este idioma. Create a small character of yourself who lives in that language. At first, it feels like play, but that's exactly how the brain learns. It must believe before it can master. The more time you spend being this version of yourself, the more natural the language becomes. Fluency comes long before perfection, because the brain begins to recognize the language as part of your identity.
Listen to me carefully now, because this is the moment where everything connects, the point where learning stops being technique and becomes transformation. When you combine the identity method with reverse teaching, language stops being something you force and becomes something that shapes you. Every new phrase you understand is an expansion of consciousness. Now imagine that you wake up tomorrow and truly decide to learn a new language. No empty promises, no lists of words you'll forget in 2 days.
I want you to understand how the brain actually creates fluency. The first step is meaningful exposure. Choose a real theme from your life, something that awakens curiosity in you. It could be cooking, philosophy, travel, anything. Then find a short 1-minute audio or video in that language. Listen without trying to translate. Let your brain get used to the sounds, the rhythm, the unknown. The secret is to listen to the same content over and over until the strangeness disappears. The second step, repeat out loud. Even if you get it wrong, sound repetition creates new connections in the brain. If possible, record your voice. This isn't vanity, it's neurotraining. The brain needs to hear itself to recognize the language as its own. The third step is what I call the pattern of the day. Choose one simple structure and use it in real situations. For example, je suis à la maison, estoy en casa. Then transform it. Je suis prêt, estoy cansado, je suis heureux. Repeat these variations like you're playing the same musical note until it sounds natural. The fourth step is to narrate your own life. Talk to yourself constantly. Je vais dormir, voy a trabajar, je prends un café. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The language must live inside every gesture until it becomes natural. The fifth step is to teach what you've learned. Speak out loud and explain it to yourself as if you were giving a lesson. This practice forces the brain to reorganize what it knows. That's where fluency begins, when the mind stops repeating and starts understanding. Finally, the sixth step. Create a sacred daily time where you live the language. No other languages, just that one. Become this new you for 30 minutes a day. Speak, think, write, and act like someone who already masters it. The brain believes what you repeat with emotion, and when it believes, it changes. This isn't motivation, it's biology. Now listen closely, because this is where learning becomes permanent. A language only becomes part of you when it stops being an exercise and becomes a state of mind. Starting tomorrow, begin your day without touching your phone. In those first few minutes of the morning, think in the new language. Take a deep breath and say, quietly but firmly, a short and true phrase. Je suis le maître de mon esprit, or Yo controlo mi mente. Say it with conviction. The brain responds to intention before repetition. Then visualize what you'll learn that day. See yourself speaking naturally. Imagine the words flowing effortlessly. That mental picture is the map your brain will try to follow. During the day, protect that map. Set fixed moments of practice and treat them as sacred appointments with your future. Turn off distractions, shut the world out, and dive into the language. Repeat, make mistakes, laughing, but don't stop. Every time you move through discomfort, the brain recognizes that knowledge as important and strengthens it. At night, before sleeping, spend 5 quiet minutes reviewing what you've learned. Don't read or write, just think in the language. Let the sentences echo in your mind like background music. Your brain will keep learning while you sleep, reorganizing and reinforcing what you practiced. This is true discipline, repeating with presence, not obligation. And remember, the language itself is not the final goal. It's the path that leads you to expansion, clarity, and confidence. When you master a new language, you're not just learning to speak to others, you're learning to speak with new versions of yourself. To speak another language is ultimately to discover how many worlds already live inside you. Learning a language is in truth a training of perception. The brain begins to see the world from another angle, and that changes everything, even the way you think about your own life. When you start to think inside another language, you discover that certain emotions exist only within specific words. French teaches you the art of subtlety. Spanish reveals a kind of intensity that English sometimes hides. You're not just memorizing sounds, you're becoming more human. And that's why people who master languages are never the same afterward. They develop empathy, creativity, and mental flexibility. Because every language is a window into a different way of feeling. And the more windows you open, the freer you become. Polyglots aren't just people who speak many languages. They're people who feel in many frequencies. That's true genius.
not memorizing, but expanding perception. When you embrace discomfort, when you speak even without certainty, when you persist even without perfection, the brain understands what's happening. It realizes you're serious. And when the brain recognizes commitment, it changes levels. It begins to prioritize that learning, to process it while you sleep, to build bridges between memories. That's why one day suddenly you wake up and realize you're thinking in another language, effortlessly, without translation, without even noticing. That's the moment when a language stops being something you learn and becomes something you are. Leave a like if this message resonated with you, and make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. Here you'll learn to train your mind in a way schools never taught you. Simple, powerful, and transformative. And write in the comments, "My mind is ready to learn." That simple phrase is more than a comment. It's a reprogramming.
Keep learning, even when no one is watching. True transformation doesn't happen in front of cameras. It happens in the silence of those who practice every day. And before you know it, you'll realize you didn't just learn a new language. You learned how to speak with the infinite inside you. Thank you for watching until the end. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. There's a pattern hiding in plain sight that most people miss completely when they're trying to learn something new. It's not about working harder or spending more hours with your nose buried in a book. It's about understanding how the mind actually builds knowledge versus how we've been taught to think it works. The difference is extraordinary. One approach leaves you frustrated, forgetting everything within days. Makes ideas stick permanently, almost effortlessly. And the strange part, most people spend their entire lives using the first method. Why learning feels like such a struggle? Here's what typically happens when someone decides to learn something. They open a textbook, start reading from page 1, try to absorb everything in order. They highlight passages, they take notes, they reread the same material multiple times. Then, test day arrives, or when they actually need to use what they learned, they discover that most of it has evaporated from their mind like water on hot pavement. Sound familiar? This isn't a personal failing. This is what happens when you approach learning the way most educational systems have conditioned us to approach it. We've been trained to treat knowledge like filling a container, pouring information in until it's full. But the mind doesn't work that way. It never has. The mind builds connections. It creates networks. It links new information to existing understanding through active reconstruction, not passive absorption. When you simply read and reread, asking your brain to memorize without giving it the structure it needs to actually understand. And without understanding, there's nothing for the memory to anchor to. The last time you really learned something that stayed with you permanently, not memorized for a test and forgotten, truly learned. Chances are, you didn't learn it by reading the same explanation over and over. You learned it by wrestling with it, by trying to use it before you fully understood it, making mistakes and correcting them, by explaining it to someone else, even if that someone was just yourself talking out loud. This is the pattern. The mind learns by doing the work of reconstruction, not by passively receiving information. Every time you force yourself to recall something without looking at the source, every time you try to explain a concept in your own words, every time you attempt to solve a problem before checking the answer, engaging the exact mechanism that makes learning permanent. But we resist this. We resist it because it feels harder. It feels less efficient. When you're reading a textbook, you're making progress. The pages turn. The material looks familiar. You get that comfortable sensation of recognition. But recognition isn't understanding. Recognition is just your mind saying, "Yes, I've seen these symbols before." That's not the same as being able to reconstruct the idea from scratch. Here's the fundamental principle that changes everything. Your mind doesn't store information like a filing cabinet stores folders. It stores the ability to regenerate ideas. Think about how you remember a song. You don't store every note in some mental database. You store the pattern, and your mind regenerates the melody when you need it. Learning works the same way. When you try to recall something, when you struggle to regenerate an idea without looking at your notes, brain strengthens the pathways that allow you to reconstruct that knowledge. The struggle isn't a sign that the method isn't working. The struggle is the method working. Feeling of difficulty, that mental strain when you're trying to remember or work something out, that's your brain building the exact pathways you need. Now, most people make a critical mistake. They feel that difficulty and think they're not ready. They think they need to study more before testing themselves. So they go back to rereading, reviewing, going over the material again and again until it feels comfortable. But by doing this, avoiding the very process that creates real learning. The brain needs resistance to build strength, just like muscles need resistance to grow. You're reading material for the third time, and it all seems obvious. You're not learning. You're experiencing the illusion of competence. The material seems clear because you're looking right at it. But close the book and watch how quickly that clarity evaporates. What you want to do instead is close the book much earlier than feels comfortable. Before you think you're ready, try to write out the main ideas from memory. Not word for word, in your own understanding. If you can't do it, that's not failure. That's information. That's your mind showing you exactly where the gaps are. And those gaps are valuable. They tell you what to focus on. Then, after you've struggled with it, after you've tried and perhaps failed to reconstruct the idea, that's when you go back to the material. Your mind is ready to learn. Now you have specific questions. Now you're not just passively reading. You're actively filling in gaps that you've already identified. The difference in retention is dramatic. This applies to everything: mathematics, physics, language, history, anything. The method is always the same: engage with the material actively, not passively. Force yourself to generate answers rather than recognize them. Build the knowledge rather than try to store it. Let's take mathematics as an example. Most people approach learning mathematics by reading through example problems, following along with the solution, nodding when it makes sense, and then moving on to the next problem. Even copy the solution into their notes. Then when they sit down to do problems on their own, they're stuck. They can't replicate what seemed so clear when they were looking at the example. Why? Because watching someone else solve a problem and solving it yourself are completely different mental activities. When you're watching, you're following a path someone else has cleared. When you're solving, you're clearing the path yourself. And it's only in clearing that path that you actually learn where the obstacles are and how to navigate around them. The effective approach is this: look at a problem, close the book, try to solve it. Even if you have no idea where to start, try anyway. Write something down. Make an attempt. The attempt itself, even if wrong, prepares your mind to understand the solution in a way that passive reading never could. When you then look at the solution, just following steps, you're seeing what you missed, understanding why your approach didn't work, building genuine understanding. The same applies to reading difficult material. Don't just read a chapter from start to finish, taking notes along the way. Instead, read a section, close the book, and try to explain the main idea to yourself, out loud if possible. Use your own words. Draw your own diagrams. If you can't do it, if the explanation falls apart or doesn't make sense, that tells you exactly what you need to reread. You're not rereading everything. You're strategically going back to the specific parts that you couldn't reconstruct. This makes studying more efficient, not less. You spend less time overall because you're focusing your effort exactly where it needs to go, than spreading it equally across material you already understand and material you don't. Now, there's a deeper reason why this pattern works. It has to do with how knowledge exists in the mind. Understanding isn't a thing you possess. It's a process you can perform. When you truly understand something, what you have is the ability to reconstruct the reasoning, to regenerate the concept from fundamental principles. You don't need to remember every detail because you can derive the details from the underlying structure. This is why someone who genuinely understands a subject can explain it in multiple ways, can answer questions they've never heard before, can adapt their knowledge to new situations. Retrieving memorized answers. They're generating answers based on their understanding of how things work. And how do you develop that ability to generate rather than retrieve? Practicing generation. By forcing yourself to work things out rather than looking up answers. By explaining concepts in your own words rather than repeating the textbook's words. By solving problems rather than reading solutions. The mind is remarkably good at finding shortcuts. If you give it the option to recognize an answer rather than generate one, take that option every time. Recognition is easier, faster, requires less energy. But recognition doesn't build understanding. Generation builds understanding. This looks like in practice. Suppose you're trying to learn the physics of how objects fall. The standard approach would be to read about gravity, read the equations, study example problems, maybe do a few practice problems that are very similar to the examples. You'd feel like you understand because the equations look familiar and the examples make sense. But now try this before reading anything. Try to figure out on your own what determines how fast something falls. Just think about it. Come up with hypotheses. Does the weight matter? Does the height matter? Write down your ideas. They'll probably be wrong. That's fine. That's perfect, actually. Now, when you read the actual explanation, you're not just passively receiving information. You're comparing your ideas against what's really happening. You're seeing where your intuition was right and where it was wrong. You're building understanding by seeing the contrast between your initial model and the correct model. This creates learning that sticks because you're not just memorizing facts, understanding why those facts are what they are and not something else. This works for everything. Before reading a historical account, ask yourself what you think happened and why. Before learning a formula, try to derive it yourself from principles you already know. Before accepting an explanation, try to come up with alternative explanations and see if you can figure out why they don't work. You're not trying to reinvent everything from scratch. You're preparing your mind to understand by engaging it actively. You're creating questions that the material will answer. A mind with questions learns differently than a mind that's just trying to absorb whatever it's given. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it makes learning interesting. Actively working things out when you're testing your understanding, when you're catching your own mistakes, you're engaged. You're not bored. The mind likes problems. It likes puzzles. Give it the work of figuring things out and it performs magnificently. Ask it to sit still and absorb information passively, and it rebels. This is also why explaining concepts to others is so powerful for learning. When you explain something, you can't rely on recognition to generate the explanation from your understanding, and in doing so, you immediately discover what you actually understand versus what you only thought you understood. The gaps become obvious. The places where your explanation gets fuzzy or circular, those are exactly the places where your understanding is incomplete. You don't need another person for this to work. Explain concepts to yourself. Pretend you're teaching an invisible student. Write out explanations as if you're writing a textbook. The act of putting understanding into words, into your own words, forces a kind of mental clarity that passive reading never demands. And here's something crucial. Afraid of making mistakes during this process. Mistakes aren't obstacles to learning. They're part of the mechanism of learning. When you try to solve a problem and get it wrong, when you try to explain something and realize your explanation doesn't make sense, that's not wasted time. That's your brain identifying exactly where to focus its effort. The education system has trained us to fear mistakes, to see them as failures. But in actual learning, mistakes are incredibly valuable. They show you the difference between what you thought you knew and what you actually know. They create the mental friction that leads to real understanding. So make mistakes deliberately before you know how to solve them. Attempt explanations before you've mastered the material. Test yourself before you feel ready. Every mistake is information. Every gap you discover is an opportunity to build genuine understanding rather than the illusion of knowledge. Think about how children learn to speak. Study grammar rules and vocabulary lists. They try to communicate, make mistakes, get corrected, try again. They're constantly generating language, testing what works, adjusting based on feedback. It's messy and full of errors, but it works. They develop the ability to generate language rather than just recognize it. Apply that same principle to any kind of learning. Generate first. Test yourself first. Try to work things out before looking up the answer. It feels harder because it is harder in the right way. Hard in the way that builds capability rather than just creating the temporary sensation of familiarity. The pattern is simple. Engage actively with what you're learning. Force yourself to reconstruct rather than recognize. Build understanding through the work of generation, passive absorption of information. Test yourself before you feel ready. Make mistakes and learn from them. Explain concepts in your own words. Struggle with problems before looking at solutions. This isn't a trick or a hack. This is just aligning your study methods with how the mind actually learns. The mind learns by building the capacity to regenerate knowledge, not by trying to store it like data in a file. Give your mind the work of regeneration, and it will build genuine, permanent understanding. Everything you truly know, you know, because at some point you did the work of figuring it out, of working through it, of making it your own. That's the only way knowledge becomes real, not by reading about it, not by recognizing it, by generating it yourself from your own understanding in your own mind. That's the pattern. Use it and watch what happens to everything you try to learn.
You know, people often ask me how I manage to understand so many different things. Physics, mathematics, biology, even safe cracking and bongo drums. They assume there must be some kind of trick to it, some natural talent I was born with. But that's not really true. The truth is much simpler and perhaps more useful. I learned how to learn. And once you know how to learn, everything becomes possible. Let me tell you about something that happened when I was working at Los Alamos during the war. We had all these brilliant people, some of the greatest minds in physics, and we were all working on this enormous problem. One day, I was sitting in the cafeteria with some colleagues, and they were discussing a particular aspect of neutron diffusion. The conversation was full of complex equations and technical terms, and I noticed that while everyone was nodding along, I had this uncomfortable feeling that I didn't really understand what we were talking about. Not deeply, anyway. Now, I could have just stayed quiet and pretended to understand. That's what most people do. But I had learned something important years before, something my father taught me when I was just a boy. He taught me that knowing the name of something is not the same as knowing something, and that distinction changed everything for me. My father used to take me on walks in the Catskill Mountains. He wasn't a scientist, he was in the uniform business, but he had this wonderful way of looking at the world. We'd see a bird, and he'd say, "You see that bird? In German, it's called a Fehlstorch. In Chinese, they call it a Chungling. In Japanese, a Katakataka. You can know all those names in every language in the world, but when you're done, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know about people in different places and what they call a bird." Now, he'd say, "That bird is a brown-throated thrush, and it's singing because it's defending its territory or attracting a mate. When it moves like that, it's looking for insects. That's beginning to know something." This lesson stuck with me, really stuck, because I realized that most of what we call knowledge is actually just familiarity with labels. We mistake the map for the territory. We think because we can name something, we understand it. But understanding is something else entirely. So back to that cafeteria at Los Alamos. When I felt that uncomfortable sensation of not really understanding, I did what I always do. I went back to my room, took out some paper, and I started to work through the problem myself. Not by memorizing what the others had said, but by trying to explain it to myself from scratch, as if I were teaching it to someone who knew nothing about physics. I wrote, "Okay, what is neutron diffusion really about? What's actually happening?" And then I tried to explain it in the simplest possible terms. Not using the fancy equations first, those would come later, but using plain language. I imagined I was explaining it to someone like my father, someone intelligent but without technical training. And here's what happened. I got stuck. I couldn't explain it simply because I didn't understand it well enough. There were gaps in my knowledge that I had been papering over with technical jargon. So I went back to the basic principles. I looked at what I did understand solidly, and I built up from there, piece by piece, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When I finally could explain it in simple terms, something magical happened. I understood it better than I had before, much better. And more than that, I could see connections to other things I knew. I could see where the equations came from, what they really meant, why they had to be that way and not some other way. This became my method. Whenever I needed to learn something, anything, I would follow this same process. I'd take a blank piece of paper and I'd write at the top, what is? And then whatever concept I was trying to understand. Then I'd try to explain it as if I were teaching it to someone bright but completely unfamiliar with the subject. The key is that you can't fool yourself when you do this. You can fool yourself in a lot of ways. You can memorize equations. You can learn to manipulate symbols. You can even get the right answers on tests. But when you try to explain something in plain language, the truth comes out. If you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. And let me be clear about what I mean by simply. I don't mean dumbing it down or being imprecise. I mean stripping away the unnecessary complexity, the jargon that we use to hide our lack of understanding. Einstein once said something about this, that you should be able to explain your theory to a barmaid. People laughed at that, but he was right. If you truly understand something, you can explain it in everyday language. The complexity should be in the idea itself, not in the words you use to describe it. I remember when I was trying to understand quantum electrodynamics after the war. This was a field in crisis. The theory made ridiculous predictions, infinities everywhere. People were stuck. I was stuck too, at first. I knew the mathematical machinery, sure, but I didn't really understand what was happening physically. So I started over. I got a notebook and I began to explain it to myself from the beginning. An electron moves from point A to point B. What really happens? I drew pictures, simple pictures, little arrows and lines. I didn't start with the Lagrangian formalism or the canonical approach. I started with, what is the simplest way to think about this? And you know what I discovered? All that fancy machinery that everyone was using, it was obscuring something much simpler underneath. By forcing myself to explain it simply, by using these little pictures I drew, I found a different way to do the calculations, a way that made sense to me physically. Those simple pictures eventually became what people call Feynman diagrams, and they helped solve some of the problems that had everyone confused. But here's what I want you to understand. The diagrams weren't the point. The point was the process of simplification, of explanation, of getting down to what's really happening. The diagrams were just a tool that came out of trying to understand clearly. Now, you might think this approach would be slow, and in one sense it is. It takes longer to really understand something this way than to just memorize formulas or to accept what authorities tell you. But in another sense, it's much faster. Because when you truly understand something, when you can explain it simply and clearly, you never forget it. It becomes part of how you think, and you can use it to understand new things. Because you're not just carrying around a bag of disconnected facts and formulas. You're carrying around principles that you understand deeply. I saw this when I taught at Caltech. Students would come to my office hours, frustrated because they couldn't solve a problem. They'd show me pages of equations they'd written. Look, they'd say, I know the formula, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't get the answer. And I'd ask them, what's the problem about? Physically, what's happening? Often, they couldn't tell me. They could write down the equation for conservation of energy, but they couldn't explain what energy conservation actually means. They could manipulate the symbols, but they didn't understand what the symbols represented. So I'd say, forget the equations for a moment. Tell me in words what's happening in this problem, and we'd talk through it. A ball is rolling down a hill. What does that mean? It means it's losing potential energy. Where does that energy go? Into kinetic energy, into movement. How much? Well, it depends on the height of the hill and the mass of the ball. Once they understood it that way, the equations weren't mysterious anymore. The equations were just a precise way of writing down what they already understood. They became tools instead of obstacles. This is what I mean by learning. Not memorization, not symbol manipulation. Understanding. There's another part to this, though, something equally important. When you explain something to yourself this way, you discover what you don't know. You find the boundaries of your understanding, and that's incredibly valuable. Most people avoid these boundaries. They stay in the safe zone of what they already know, or they pretend the boundaries aren't there. But the boundaries are where all the interesting stuff is. That's where learning happens. That's where the adventure begins. I remember reading about biology later in my life. I was curious about it, but I didn't have the years of background that a professional biologist would have. So I'd read a paper, and I'd come across something like the Krebs cycle, and I'd think, do I really know what that is? So I'd stop and I'd get a piece of paper and I'd try to explain the Krebs cycle to myself. What is it? Why does it happen? What's the purpose? And I'd get stuck on some step. I didn't understand why this molecule becomes that molecule. So I'd look it up. I'd read more carefully. I'd draw it out. And gradually, piece by piece, I'd build up my understanding. The beautiful thing about this method is that it works for anything. Physics, mathematics, biology, history, philosophy, it doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Take an idea and explain it to yourself simply. Find the gaps, fill them in, build from solid ground. And here's something else I discovered. When you learn this way, you often find that the experts don't understand things as well as you thought. You find inconsistencies in their explanations. You find gaps in the standard way of teaching things. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you find a better way to think about something, a clearer way, because you refuse to accept confusion. I'm not saying this to criticize experts. I'm saying it because it's liberating. You don't have to wait for someone else to explain things perfectly. You don't have to feel inadequate because a textbook confuses you. Sometimes the textbook is just poorly written. Sometimes even the experts are confused. Your job is to understand for yourself in your own way. Of course, you have to be honest with yourself, brutally honest. You can't fake understanding. When you try to explain something and you realize you're just using circular definitions or you're hand-waving over the hard parts, you have to stop and admit, I don't actually get this yet. That's okay. That's good, actually, because now you know what you need to work on. You've turned a vague feeling of confusion into a specific question, and specific questions can be answered. I think one reason many people struggle to learn new things as they get older is not because their minds are less capable, that's mostly nonsense, but because they become less willing to admit confusion. They have identities as knowledgeable people, as experts in their fields, and it's uncomfortable to feel like a beginner again, so they stay on familiar ground. But learning requires that beginner's mind. It requires being willing to say, I don't understand this yet, but I'm going to figure it out. No shame in that, no embarrassment, just curiosity and determination. When I was at Los Alamos, Hans Bethe was there, brilliant physicist, one of the best. And I noticed something about him. Whenever someone explained a new idea to him, he wouldn't just nod and accept it. He'd work through it himself, right there, often asking questions that seemed almost naive. Wait, why does that follow? I don't see how you got from this step to that step. But those naive questions often revealed that the person explaining hadn't really thought it through properly. Bethe taught me that real understanding means being able to answer the simple question, the fundamental why question. If you can't answer those, you're building on sand. So here's what I learned, and what I've tried to practice throughout my life. Learning is not about accumulating information. It's not about being able to recite facts or manipulate symbols. Learning is about building a structure of understanding, brick by brick, where each brick is solid, and you know why it's where it is. You start with what you understand clearly. You expand from there, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When you hit something you can't explain simply, that's not a failure, that's a discovery. You found the edge of your understanding. Now you can work on extending it. And you know what happens when you learn this way? You become independent. You don't need to rely on authorities or textbooks or experts to tell you what's true. You can figure things out yourself. You develop judgment. You can tell when someone is explaining something clearly and when they're hiding behind jargon. You can tell when you really understand something and when you're fooling yourself. This independence of mind, that's the real value. Not just the specific things you learn, but the ability to learn anything. The confidence that comes from knowing you can take any subject, no matter how complex or unfamiliar, and gradually make sense of it. There's a freedom in this. You're not trapped by your past education or lack of it. You're not limited by what subjects you studied in school. If you want to understand something, really understand it, you can. It might take time. It might take effort, but it's possible. I've watched people talk themselves out of learning things because they think they're not good at math, or not a science person, or whatever story they've told themselves. But those are just stories. If you're willing to start simple, admit confusion, and work through things step by step, you can understand anything. I think about my father's lesson with the bird. All those fancy names in all those languages, they're easy to collect. You can fill your head with them. You can impress people at parties, but they're empty. Real knowledge is different. Real knowledge is understanding what the bird is doing and why. Real knowledge lets you make predictions, see connections, understand how things work. And the beautiful thing is, anyone can do this. You don't need to be specially gifted. You don't need advanced degrees. You just need curiosity, honesty, and patience. You need to be willing to start simple, to admit confusion, to work through things step by step. I've spent my whole life trying to understand things, and I'm still doing it. There's always more to learn, more to figure out. And every time I sit down with a piece of paper and try to explain something to myself, I'm using the same method I developed as a young man. It never gets old because understanding never gets old. The pleasure of figuring something out, of seeing clearly what was once murky, that never diminishes. So if there's a secret to learning anything fast, it's this. Don't try to go fast, try to go deep. Try to really understand. Explain it simply. Find the gaps, fill them in. Build on solid ground. The speed comes naturally when your foundation is strong. What looks like slow, careful work at the beginning becomes rapid progress later, because you're not constantly backtracking to fix misunderstandings or rememorizing things you never really grasped. And remember, the goal isn't to know more than other people. or to be clever, or to impress anyone. The goal is to see clearly, to understand truly. Everything else, the success, the recognition, the ability to solve difficult problems, that all comes as a byproduct of genuine understanding. Chase understanding, and the rest takes care of itself. That's what I learned anyway. And it served me pretty well.
The real genius isn't the one who works the hardest. It's the one who has fun while doing what they love. Society has taught you to associate success with sacrifice, exhaustion, and suffering. But what if I told you the secret is to flip that logic upside down? That the path to the top isn't a staircase of pain, but a river of curiosity. The real secret is something much simpler and at the same time much harder: doing what you love. I never understood why people treat work like a prison. They turn what could be a game into torture, and that's exactly where they lose. Human beings were made to discover, to create, to be amazed. That's when the mind works best. It's not about waking up early, it's about waking up awake. It's not about working hard, it's about working alive. When you truly love what you do, you don't need to convince yourself to keep going. No one needs to push you. You're moved from within by something that burns quietly, the pure desire to understand. Time passes and you don't even notice. You're not working. You're playing with the universe, tinkering with the gears of reality. And when that happens, success stops being the goal, it becomes the consequence. Most people try to force the mind with cheap motivation, but motivation is volatile. What you really need is enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is different. It's born from curiosity, from passion, from love for something. And when you find it, nothing feels heavy anymore. You become light, natural, fluid. Routine turns into pleasure, and every obstacle becomes an experiment. That's why people who love what they do never work another day in their lives, because work dissolves into the joy of creation. People live in a hurry. They want to arrive fast, achieve fast, prove fast. But the secret is actually in stopping, in breathing, in realizing that success isn't a destination, it's a way of walking. Life wasn't made to be conquered, it was made to be experienced. And the process is where everything happens. When you learn to love the process, anxiety disappears. You stop watching the clock. You stop comparing yourself. You stop chasing applause that never fills anything inside you. Because suddenly you realize happiness doesn't come after. It happens during. Joy is in the moment, in the movement, in doing for the simple pleasure of doing. And that's when success stops being a goal and becomes a natural result. Most people chase results because they're afraid to get lost. But true learning happens when you get lost on purpose. When you dive into the unknown with curiosity, not fear. When you laugh at your mistakes, allow yourself to fail, and play with chaos. Because it's in playing with chaos that discoveries are born. It's in the mess that the mind lights up. You want to know when success arrives? When you forget about it. When the joy of doing is so great that the outcome no longer matters. When the simple act of creating, studying, teaching, or understanding is already enough to feed your soul. The reward isn't at the end, it's found along the way. And that's why those who learn to love the process never work another day in their lives. So look at what you do. Don't ask, how much will this give me? Ask, how does this make me feel? Because if what you do ignites something inside you, if it wakes you up, makes you lose track of time, then success has already begun. Everything else, fame, money, recognition, will come naturally as a reflection of your own joy. People talk a lot about discipline as if it were a prison, a battle against yourself. But real discipline has nothing to do with that. The kind of discipline that transforms you comes from love. No one needs willpower to do what they love. No one needs to force themselves toward what inspires them. Motivation fades, but love sustains. When you love the process, effort disappears. You wake up with energy, not because you have to, but because you want to dive deeper. Fatigue still exists, but it doesn't defeat you, because what you do has meaning. Love gives you direction, curiosity gives you energy, and discipline becomes natural. And when discipline becomes natural, success becomes inevitable. Stop fighting what you do. Start falling in love with it. Passion is the most intelligent form of discipline there is. It's the flame that never goes out.
Now pay attention, because there's a kind of noise that almost no one notices, but it controls the minds of nearly everyone. It's the noise of comparison. People spend their whole lives trying to prove something, and that's exactly why they never feel complete. They look sideways instead of inward. They want to be admired, not fulfilled. And that's the loudest noise of the modern mind. They want the car, but not for the freedom it brings. They want someone to look and say, wow. They want the expensive watch, but don't care about time. They want the big house, but spend the whole day away trying to pay for it. It's a race without a finish line, and the faster they run, the less sense it makes. The truth is, hardly anyone is really living. People are competing for attention, not for purpose. They're fighting to see who can fake it best. And the more they listen to the world's noise, the less they hear their own mind. They live to be seen, but forget to exist. And what's worse, they call that success. The problem is the noise is addictive. Tiny doses of approval keep you dependent. But in the silence you feel the emptiness. And that's why almost no one can stand it. Because silence shows who you are without the applause, and that terrifies people.
But that's exactly where freedom begins, when you stop needing to be seen.
When you realize that your peace is worth more than your image. So start ignoring the noise. Ignore the eyes of others. Ignore the market, the trends, the need to seem smart. All of that is distraction. The only sound that matters is the one that comes from your own conscience, when you're silent, doing what you love, the right way. Everything else is just echo, and no echo ever built a thought. The day you truly understand this, everything changes. You stop running. You stop trying to prove, to compete, to follow the current. Because you realize that real power lies in doing things for the right reason. And the right reason is never applause. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you're in control of your own mind. Most people live as if there's an invisible audience judging their every move. But the truth is, no one's watching. Everyone's too busy trying to look good themselves. So why waste your life trying to please people who aren't even looking? The time you spend trying to impress others is the time you lose being impressed by life itself. Freedom begins the moment you decide to silence the world and listen to what truly matters. When your joy comes from what you do, not from what others say about it. When your focus returns to what's essential, to learn, to create, to discover, to understand. That's the point when work stops being work and becomes expression. When effort turns into curiosity, and success becomes nothing more than a natural consequence. It's simple. Stop chasing the next round of applause and start chasing the next idea. Stop running after approval and start running after understanding. Because when you do what you love, truly love, the world stops being a stage. It becomes a laboratory. And that's when you stop pretending to live and start experimenting with life itself.
Ignore the noise. Don't try to be better than others. Try to be more real than you were yesterday. Because in the end, the ones who win aren't those who have the most or seem the most. It's the ones who live with purpose, who think for themselves, and who find meaning in the simple act of existing. That's the secret to never working another day in your life. To love what you do so deeply that the line between living and working disappears. Everything else is just noise, and noise teaches nothing. Before you go, I want you to comment something down below. What's been distracting you from what really matters? Write it honestly. That's what builds a community of free minds. People who think, who question, who challenge themselves. And if you made it all the way here, congratulations. Very few do. Most people stop halfway, the moment the video stops entertaining and starts confronting. But you stayed, and that says a lot about who you are. So don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next reflection. Stay curious, keep learning, and above all, keep listening to the one thing the world keeps trying to silence, your own.
Most people spend their lives accumulating this. Efasent lift the knowledge, weight with difficulty and knowledge, facts. Information, they collect it, store it, hoard it, more and more, heavier and heavier. They think this weight is strength. They think accumulation is power, but it's not. It's just weight. Heavy, burdensome, difficult to carry, and mostly useless. Hey, lift the pabar, weight effortlessly. This is what scientists understand. This is what Feynman discovered. Power isn't about how much you know. It's about what you can do with what you know. How you think. How you process. how you solve. A powerful mind isn't a full mind, it's a capable mind, not storage, capability, not collection, function. A Frecker put weights down, and the difference between these two, between accumulating knowledge and building power, that's everything. That's what separates people who know a lot from people who can do a lot. That's what creates capability instead of just credentials. Direct address error. Right now, you're probably building the wrong thing. You're accumulating knowledge, reading books, taking courses, collecting information, getting smarter in the way that doesn't actually matter. And you're missing the real work, the work of building a powerful mind, a mind that can solve problems, generate insights, create solutions, function at a level most people never reach. And today, I'm going to show you the scientist's method, Feynman's method, the specific practices that build power instead of just accumulation, that create capability instead of just collection. Not inspiration, not theory, but concrete, practical, actionable techniques that transform an ordinary mind into a powerful one. Because power isn't born, it's built. With a method, with specific practices, with deliberate development. As I walk across stage, let me start with the story that reveals the method. It's 1961. Feynman is teaching a freshman physics course at Caltech. First lecture, room full of brilliant students. Top test scores, perfect grades, the best of the best. And Feynman does something unusual. He gives them a problem, not a physics problem, a thinking problem. Share the problem. You're standing on a bathroom scale in an elevator. The elevator starts moving upward. Does the scale reading go up, down, or stay the same? Simple question, basic physics. These students have all studied physics. They all know the relevant concepts. Share the responses. Half the students say, the reading goes up because you're accelerating upward. The other half say, the reading stays the same because your mass doesn't change. Both groups are confident. Both groups use physics terminology correctly. Both groups sound like they know what they're talking about. Hey, reveal the testes. Then Feynman asks a follow-up why. Explain why. What's actually happening? What forces are involved? What's the mechanism? Silence. They can't explain it. They gave answers, right or wrong, but they don't actually understand what's happening. They've memorized concepts without building thinking power. His lesson. And Feynman tells them that knowing the answer isn't power. Understanding how to figure out the answer, that's power. You have knowledge. But you don't have power. This course is going to change that. Make the distinction. That's the distinction. That's what the scientist's method builds. Not knowledge, power. Not information, capability. Not what you know, what you can do. Present the method. So what's the method? What are the specific practices that build a powerful mind? Let me show you. 6 components, 6 practices. The complete scientist's method for building mental power. Practice 1 ARS, practice 1 learn by problem solving, not by information accumulation. This is fundamental. This is where most people go wrong from the start. Most people learn by consuming information, reading, listening, watching, absorbing. They think learning is accumulation. Scientists learn by solving problems. Every concept learned through attempting to solve. Every principle discovered through wrestling with application. Make it concrete's traditional approach. Read a chapter on Newton's laws. Learn FPMA. Understand the concepts. Then solve practice problems. Information first. Application second. Show the alternative. Scientist's approach. Here's a problem. Predict what happens when you push a box on ice. Try to solve it. Get stuck. Realize what you don't know. Then learn FMA specifically to solve this problem. Problem first. Learning second. Always. Farser explain why this builds power. So learning through problem solving builds power because your brain learns in context. You know not just what FMA is, but when to use it, how to apply it, what it's for. Learning through information accumulation builds collection. You know what a FMA is, but you don't know when or how or why. It's stored but not usable. Give Feynman example. Feynman never learned anything except through problem solving. Never read a chapter and then solved problems. Always tried to solve first, discovered what he needed to know, then learned that specific thing. That's why his knowledge was power. Every piece of information he had was learned in the context of use, immediately usable, not just stored. Marta, make the practice. The practice, never learn anything passively. Always start with a problem to solve. Get stuck, identify what you need to know. Learn that specifically, apply it immediately. Problem, agape, learning, application, always in that order. X, practice 2, practice 2. Build models, not memories. This is critical. This separates powerful thinking from educated recall. Most people build memories. They store facts, memorize information, create mental databases. Their mind is a library. Scientists build models. They create functional representations, mental simulations, working systems. Their mind is a laboratory. Make it concrete. How does the heart work? Memory approach. The heart has 4 chambers. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body. The right ventricle pumps it to the lungs. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. The left ventricle pumps it to the body. A stored information, receivable, but not functional. Show the alternative, a modal approach. Visualize a 2-pump system. Right pump handles dirty blood, sends it to cleaning station lungs. Left pump handles clean blood, sends it to body. Valves prevent backflow. Chambers allow filling and pumping in sequence. Mental simulation. Functional. You can reason with it, predict with it, apply it. A. Feder explained the power differences. With memories, you can recall. With models, you can think. Recall is limited. You can only remember what you've stored. Thinking is generative. You can figure out things you never explicitly learned. Give Feynman example. Feynman built models for everything. Physics wasn't equations to memorize. It was mental movies of particles interacting, fields fluctuating, forces acting. He could visualize what was happening, run mental simulations, see the mechanisms. That's why he could solve novel problems. His models let him think, not just recall. Civics make the practice for everything you learn. Build a mental model, a working representation, a functional simulation. Something you can run in your mind and see what happens. Don't ask, what is this? Ask, how does this work? What would I see happening? What's the mechanism? Practice 3, develop pattern recognition across domains. This is where power multiplies, where capability compounds, where one area of knowledge enhances all others. Most people learn domains specifically. Physics is physics. Biology is biology. Business is business. Separate. Isolated, no connections. Scientists see patterns across domains. The same principles appearing in different contexts. Universal patterns that transcend specific fields. And make it concrete. Oscillation appears everywhere. Pendulum swinging in physics. Predator-prey cycles in biology. Economic boom, bust cycles in finance. Population oscillations in ecology. Same mathematical pattern. Different contexts. If you recognize the pattern, you can transfer knowledge. Understanding oscillation in one domain gives you insight into all domains where it appears. First, show the power. This is multiplicative. Learn one pattern, gain insight into 10 different fields. Learn 10 patterns, understand 100 different phenomena. Your power isn't proportional to what you know. It's exponential, because patterns let you apply knowledge across domains. I give Feynman example. Feynman was famous for this. He'd solve biology problems using physics thinking. Computer problems using quantum mechanics insights, teaching problems using scientific methods. Not because he knew everything, because he recognized patterns. Same structures appearing in different clothes. That recognition gave him power far beyond his specific knowledge. When make the practice. The practice, when you learn something in one domain, ask, where else does this pattern appear? What other fields have similar structures? How is this principle universal? Build a library of patterns. Not a library of facts. Patterns transfer. Facts don't. Practice. Practice 4, test your understanding through prediction. This is how scientists know they have power, not just knowledge. Through prediction. Through anticipating outcomes before they happen. Most people test understanding through recall. Can I remember this? Can I recite that? Memory tests. Scientists test understanding through prediction. Can I predict what will happen? Can I anticipate the outcome? Power tests. Make it concrete. You've learned about supply and demand. Memory test. Define supply and demand. Explain the relationship. You can pass that by memorizing. Doesn't prove power. Show the alternative, a power test. A new iPhone releases next week. Apple announces they manufactured fewer units than expected. What happens to prices on launch day? What happens a month later when more inventory arrives? Prediction requires understanding. Requires functional knowledge. Can't fake it with memorization. Fever explain why this matters. Prediction reveals whether your knowledge is power. If you can predict accurately, your understanding is functional. If you can't, you have stored information but not usable capability. Give Feynman example. Feynman constantly tested himself through prediction. Before doing an experiment, he'd predict the outcome. Before reading further in a paper, he'd predict what would come next. Before seeing a solution, he'd predict the approach. Right or wrong, the practice built power. Forced him to use his understanding functionally, not just store it passively. Make the practice before looking at solutions, answers, or outcomes. Predict. Use your understanding to anticipate. Right or wrong, you're building power by forcing functional use of knowledge. Make prediction a habit, constant. Automatic. Every situation is a test of whether your knowledge is power. Practice 5. Practice 5. Cultivate productive confusion. This sounds wrong, but it's crucial. It's where power develops most rapidly. Most people avoid confusion. It feels bad, uncomfortable, like failure. So they seek clarity, certainty, comfort. Scientists cultivate confusion intentionally. They seek situations that confuse them, problems that perplex them, phenomena that don't make sense yet. Explain why confusion is your brain encountering the limits of its current models, the edge of its understanding, the boundary of its power. That's where growth happens. That's where power expands, not in comfort, in confusion. Make it concrete. You're learning quantum mechanics, reading about superposition. It doesn't make sense, confusing, uncomfortable. Most people push through. Try to get it, seek clearer explanations, avoid the confusion. Show the alternative. Scientists sit with the confusion. This is confusing. Why? What specifically doesn't make sense? What's my current model? Why does it fail here? What would a better model look like? The confusion is information. It reveals exactly where your understanding needs development. That's valuable. That's where power grows. Give Feynman an example. If Feynman said, "I can live with doubt and uncertainty." I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. He cultivated confusion, sought it, stayed in it, let it drive his learning. That's how he developed such powerful thinking, by living at the edge of his understanding instead of in the comfort of clarity. Make the practice. When you encounter confusion, don't rush past it, examine it. What specifically confuses me? What model am I using that fails here? What would I need to understand to resolve this confusion? Confusion is the boundary of your power. Stay there. That's where power expands. Practice 6, teach to expose gaps. This is the final practice, the ultimate test and builder of power. Most people teach to share what they know, to transfer information, to explain things clearly. Scientists teach to discover what they don't know, to expose gaps, to reveal illusions of understanding. Make it concrete. You think you understand evolution. You've read about it, studied it, can discuss it. Then you try to teach it to someone who knows nothing, and you get stuck. Realize you can't explain certain parts. Don't understand specific mechanisms. Have gaps in your model. Show the value. Teaching exposes those gaps, reveals illusions, shows where your power is real and where it's imagined. And that revelation is valuable. Now you know exactly what to learn, where to develop, how to build real power instead of just collecting information. As our Give Feynman example, Feynman's famous technique, explain a concept to someone who knows nothing using simple words. Where you get stuck, where you need jargon, where you can't simplify, those are your gaps, not a teaching technique, a power-building technique, a method for discovering and filling gaps in your understanding. Make the practice. The practice regularly. Teach what you're learning, to friends, to family, to imaginary people out loud with no jargon. Where you struggle, you found gaps. Fill those gaps specifically. Teach again. Repeat until smooth. Each cycle builds power, real power, functional capability. Bring method together ether. So that's the complete method. 6 practices that build a powerful mind. 1. Learn by problem solving, not information accumulation. 2. Build models, not memories. 3. Develop pattern recognition across domains. 4. Test through prediction. 5. Cultivate productive confusion. 6. Teach to expose gaps. Make the promise. Use these 6 practices consistently, and you build a powerful mind, not just a full mind, a capable mind. Power, not just knowledge. Tell transformation story. And let me tell you about someone who applied this method. Call him David. David was a software engineer. Good education. CS degree. Years of experience, knew a lot about programming, lots of knowledge, but limited power, could build what he'd built before. Struggled with novel problems, couldn't transfer knowledge across languages or frameworks. His knowledge didn't translate to power. The discoveries. Then he learned the scientist's method. 6 practices for building power, and he decided to apply them systematically. His implementation ends. Practice 1 stopped reading tutorials. Started with problems. I want to build this thing. Try to build it. Get stuck. Learn what I need specifically to solve the blockage. Problem-driven learning. Every piece of knowledge acquired in context of use. Continue. Practice 2 built mental models of how systems work. Not memorizing syntax. Visualizing what code does. Running mental simulations of execution. Functional understanding. Practice 3 recognize patterns. This is just a state machine. I've seen that in embedded systems and game AI. Same pattern, different context. Transferred knowledge across domains. Continui. Practice 4 predicted outcomes before running code. If I write this, what should happen? Test through prediction. Build power through anticipation. Practice 5 cultivated confusion. When something didn't make sense, sat with it. Examined it. Why is this confusing? What's my model? How does it fail? Let confusion drive deeper understanding. Continue. Practice 6 taught constantly to junior developers. To non-programmers, to himself out loud, exposed gaps, filled them, built real power. Of the transformation 6 months different developer. Not just better at what he knew, capable with what he didn't know, could tackle novel problems, transfer across domains, generate solutions. 2 years, senior position, leading complex projects. Not because he knew more languages or frameworks, because he had power, real capability. Make the universal point. That's what the method builds. That's what these practices create. Not collection. Capability, not storage. Power. Avase address the deeper principle that here's the deeper principle that makes this method work. Your mind isn't a container. It's a processor. Its power isn't determined by how much it holds. It's determined by what it can do. Make the analogy of think of computers. You can have a computer with a terabyte hard drive and a weak processor. Lots of storage, little power. Can store massive amounts of data but can barely run programs. Or you can have a computer with a small hard drive and a powerful processor. Limited storage, enormous power, can run complex programs, solve difficult problems, generate solutions. As I apply to minds first, most people build the first kind, big storage. Weak processing. They accumulate knowledge but don't develop capability. The scientist method builds the second kind, sufficient storage, powerful processing, capability to solve, create, generate, think. Make the choice clear. So what do you want to build? A mind that knows a lot or a mind that can do a lot? The answer determines your approach, determines whether you accumulate or develop, collect or build. That present the mindset shift. This requires a mindset shift, a fundamental change in how you think about learning and intelligence. Has shift 1 in shift 1 from what do I know to what can I do? Stop measuring yourself by information accumulated. Start measuring by problems solved, capabilities developed, functions mastered. Shift 2. From how much have I learned to how powerful is my thinking. Stop counting books, read courses taken, facts memorized. Start assessing thinking capability, problem solving power, functional ability. A shift 3. From I need to know this to I need to be able to do this. Stop asking, what should I know? Start asking, what should I be able to do? What capability do I need? What power am I building toward? Make these shifts concrete. These aren't semantic. These fundamentally change your approach to learning and development. What do I know? Leads to accumulation. What can I do? Leads to power. How much learned? Leads to collection. How powerful is my thinking? Leads to capability. I need to know this. Leads to storage. I need to be able to do this. Leads to function. Share the implementation. So how do you implement this method? How do you actually build a powerful mind starting today? Give the plan week 1, start with practice 1. Learn something through problem solving. No passive reading. Pick a problem you want to solve. Try to solve it. Learn what you need as you need it. Week 2, add practice 2. As you learn, build mental models. Visualize mechanisms, create functional representations. Not what is it called, but how does it work? Week 3, add practice 3. Look for patterns. What you're learning. Where else does this appear? What's universal about this structure? Continue week 4, add practice 4. Start predicting. Before seeing solutions, predict what will happen. Test your understanding through anticipation. Week 5, add practice 5. When confused, examine the confusion. Don't rush past it. Let it reveal where you need development. Week 6, add practice 6. Teach what you're learning. Expose your gaps. Fill them. Build real power. Hours, make the time frame of 6 weeks to implement all 6 practices. Then maintain them. Make them habits. Your default approach to learning and thinking. Act, promise the result. 6 months of this method, measurably more powerful thinking. Can solve problems you couldn't before. Understand concepts that were opaque before. Generate insights that were impossible before. 1 year. Unrecognizable capability. Your thinking power has multiplied. Your ability to solve, create, understand has expanded dramatically. S are walk to center S. So here's what you need to understand. Most people are building the wrong thing. They're accumulating knowledge, collecting information, getting educated. But education isn't power. Collection isn't capability. Knowledge isn't the same as a powerful mind. Facts direct statement error. A powerful mind is built through specific practices. The scientist's method. 6 deliberate approaches that develop capability, not just accumulation. They repeat the method. Learn through problem solving. Build models, not memories. Recognize patterns across domains. Test through prediction. Cultivate productive confusion. Teach to expose gaps. Act the promise. Use this method consistently, and you build real power. Thinking capability that multiplies over time. Problem-solving ability that compounds. Understanding that generates insight, not by knowing more, by being able to do more with what you know. Final challenge. So here's my challenge. Pick one capability you want to develop. One thing you want to be able to do. Not one thing you want to know. One thing you want to do. And build that capability using the scientist's method. Start with a problem that requires that capability. Try to solve it. Get stuck. Learn what you need. Build models. Recognize patterns. Predict outcomes. Sit with confusion. Teach it. Make the prediction. Do this, and you'll discover something profound. Power doesn't come from accumulation. Power comes from development, from building capability systematically through practice. A final statement: you don't need more knowledge. You need a more powerful mind, and a powerful mind isn't born, it's built, with a method, with practices, with deliberate development. But pauses. That's the scientist's method. That's how Feynman built his extraordinary thinking capability. That's how you can build yours. Not by collecting more, by developing power. Thank you. Inten, if you want detailed techniques for each of these 6 practices, if you want specific exercises for problem solving, learning, model building, pattern recognition, prediction testing, productive confusion, and teaching to expose gaps, do me a favor. Like this video and subscribe to the Mind of Richard Feynman channel. We're exploring how to build real thinking power, how to develop capability, not just accumulate information, how to create a powerful mind. Join us. Let's build power together. See you in the next one.